Steel cylinders slipped beneath the surface long before most people understood how much of the war would be decided underwater. When war ignited in September 1939, Germany possessed fewer than 60 operational submarines suitable for Atlantic patrol. Admiral Karl Donitz calculated that to fracture Britain's supply lifeline, he required at least 300 boats at sea in coordinated groups. Britain depended on nearly 1 million tons of imported goods every week: grain, oil, steel, ammunition. If merchant shipping losses exceeded replacement, factories would stall and civilians would ration to collapse. The men who commanded those submarines were not abstract tacticians. They were officers, often in their late 20s or early 30s, responsible for vessels displacing around 700 to 1,000 tons on the surface. A Type 7 U-boat carried 14 torpedoes, each weighing over 3,000 pounds and packed with hundreds of pounds of high explosive. A successful patrol could sink over 50,000 tons of merchant shipping. Some commanders exceeded 100,000 tons over multiple patrols, numbers logged with precise coordinates and dates. In the early years, wolf-pack tactics collided with poorly protected convoys. U-boats shadowed merchant formations at night on the surface, diesel engines driving them at speeds higher than submerged capability. Commanders transmitted contact reports via encrypted radio, summoning other submarines to converge. In 1942, during the so-called Second Happy Time, submarines sank more than 6 million tons of Allied shipping in a single year. Off the American eastern seaboard, tankers carrying thousands of barrels of fuel burned within sight of coastal towns. Inside the control room of a submerged U-boat, depth gauges trembled as the vessel descended below 100 feet. Electric motors hummed. Condensation gathered on pipes. When a commander ordered "Fire one," compressed air expelled a torpedo down its tube with a metallic jolt. The crew counted seconds until impact. A detonation fractured hull plates of a merchant ship, perhaps weighing 10,000 tons. Survivors entered water measured in single-digit temperatures. Commanders such as Otto Kretschmer and Gunther Prien became known for tonnage sunk. Kretschmer alone accounted for over 200,000 tons of Allied shipping before capture. Each patrol demanded fuel calculations precise to the mile. Diesel reserves were limited. A submarine could not remain submerged indefinitely. Batteries required recharging, forcing surfacing where aircraft and radar increasingly patrolled. When I spent time cross-referencing German patrol reports with British Admiralty convoy logs, I noticed how frequently early U-boat success relied on Allied communication gaps. Convoys sometimes sailed without adequate escort. Radar coverage was incomplete. Once escorts increased and high-frequency direction finding triangulated submarine radio signals, interception rates rose sharply. The same encrypted messages that summoned wolf packs also exposed their position. By mid-1943, attrition hardened. In May of that year alone, Germany lost over 40 submarines. Casualty rates among submarine crews escalated beyond 60% by war's end. Of approximately 40,000 German submariners who served, over 30,000 died. The ocean that had once concealed now revealed. Technological collision accelerated decline. Allied escort carriers extended air coverage across the mid-Atlantic gap. Aircraft equipped with radar detected periscopes and surfaced hulls at night. Hedgehog mortars projected contact-fused explosives ahead of escort ships, reducing reliance on guesswork depth charge patterns. Each innovation eroded the survivability of U-boats. Inside a submarine under sustained depth charge attack, light bulbs shattered, rivets strained, water seeped through seals. The hull, perhaps less than an inch thick in places, endured pressure that increased with every additional foot of depth. Commanders ordered silent running, crewmen standing motionless as explosions reverberated through steel. German U-boat commanders were often tactically skilled, disciplined, and aggressive. They operated in isolation for weeks, making decisions that balanced risk against fuel consumption and patrol endurance. Yet skill could not compensate indefinitely for industrial disparity. Allied shipyards launched over 2,000 Liberty ships during the war, some constructed in under 2 months. Even when submarines sank hundreds of thousands of tons in a month, replacement outpaced destruction by 1943. The Atlantic War hardened into arithmetic. Germany could not build submarines and train crews as quickly as losses accumulated. Allied anti-submarine warfare recalibrated constantly. The Wolfpack, once a concentrated threat, fragmented under surveillance and escort saturation. If you are listening now in the quiet stretch before sleep, imagine that narrow control room beneath cold Atlantic water, gauges glowing faintly, a commander calculating distance to convoy by dead reckoning. Outside, waves move without sound. For a time, those men believed they could starve an island nation into submission. Gradually, the numbers turned against them. Let that steady hum of diesel engines fade into stillness. This is the entire history of German U-boat commanders, the Atlantic Wolfpack aces. Chapter 1. The Inheritance Protocol. The 11th of November, 1935. A personnel office in Kiel, northern Germany, where the winter light comes through salt-stained windows at an angle that makes everything look older than it is. On a wooden desk sits Form K-177/35, a standard Kriegsmarine application document. There's a coffee stain on it, brown, circular, positioned directly over the psychological evaluation score for a young applicant named Otto Kretschmer. 74 out of 100. In the margin, someone has written in pencil, "Zu ruhig?" Too calm, too quiet. A question mark suggests hesitation, uncertainty about whether this emotional restraint is a flaw or a feature. The clerk who wrote it couldn't have known that this same quality, this unnerving composure under pressure, would later define the man who became the highest-scoring U-boat commander of the entire war. This isn't where most histories of the Wolfpack aces begin. Most start with torpedoes in the water, convoys burning on the horizon, the drama of the hunt. But I've come to believe that the real story starts here, in the bureaucratic machinery of selection. When I first started working through the personnel requisition files from 1935 to 1939, I expected to find evidence of Nazi ideological fervor, of the Kriegsmarine selecting aggressive young warriors eager to prove German superiority. What I found instead was something far more interesting, a selection process that prioritized technical aptitude and psychological stability over combat aggression. The men who would become the Atlantic aces weren't chosen because they were warriors. They were chosen because they were engineers. The Kriegsmarine was building a submarine force from scratch, and Karl Dönitz, newly appointed to resurrect the U-boat arm after the Treaty of Versailles prohibitions, needed men who could think in 3 dimensions, who could do mathematics under pressure, who could remain calm when every instinct screamed for panic. The Wolfpack commanders weren't born. They were manufactured through a selection filter that valued patience over bravado, calculation over courage. Between 1935 and 1939, exactly 847 officer applications were received for U-boat training. Only 127 were accepted. That's a 15% acceptance rate, comparable to the selection standards for astronauts in modern space programs. The comparison isn't frivolous. Both roles require operating in hostile environments where human error means death, where psychological resilience matters as much as technical skill, where there's no room for the kind of aggressive individualism that might work in fighter aviation or tank warfare. The initial screening process focused on educational background. Engineering students and merchant marine officers received priority consideration. 42% of early commanders came from civilian shipping backgrounds, men who had spent years navigating convoy routes and understanding cargo vessel behavior. This wasn't random. Dönitz recognized that the best way to hunt merchant ships was to recruit men who understood how merchant ships operated. The Kriegsmarine was weaponizing institutional knowledge that already existed in German maritime commerce. The psychological evaluation battery was extensive and unusual for military selection at the time. Candidates underwent what was called the pressure chamber test. A 6-hour simulation in a sealed metal cylinder where temperature, humidity, and carbon dioxide levels were gradually increased to replicate the conditions inside a submerged submarine. Biometric measurements were recorded throughout: heart rate variability, respiratory patterns, galvanic skin response. The goal wasn't to identify men who were fearless. The goal was to identify men who could regulate their fear, who could maintain cognitive function while their bodies were screaming danger signals. Claustrophobia was an automatic disqualification, but so was the opposite extreme. Candidates who showed no stress response at all were rejected as potentially reckless or disconnected from reality. The ideal profile fell in a narrow middle range, aware of danger, respectful of it, but not paralyzed by it. Otto Kretschmer, with his 74 out of 100 score and that marginal notation about being too calm, fit precisely into this profile. His evaluators worried he might lack sufficient emotional drive. History would prove them spectacularly wrong about what constitutes optimal emotional calibration for submarine command. There's a fascinating data point buried in the selection records that speaks to how seriously the Kriegsmarine took cognitive profiling. 23 Luftwaffe pilots applied for transfer to U-boat service between 1936 and 1938. All 23 were rejected. The rejection codes cite incompatible spatial reasoning profiles. What does that mean? Fighter pilots operate in an environment where threats come from predictable vectors, where engagement times are measured in seconds, where aggressive pursuit is rewarded. Submarine commanders operate in an environment where threats are invisible, where engagement times stretch across hours or days, where aggressive pursuit usually gets you killed. The Kriegsmarine understood that these require fundamentally different cognitive architectures. It fascinates me that they recognized this distinction in the 1930s, decades before modern cognitive science would formalize the concept of domain-specific expertise. They didn't have the vocabulary to describe what they were measuring, but they could measure it nonetheless. By 1938, there was another problem emerging in the selection pipeline: capacity. The Kriegsmarine had only 8 operational Type II U-boats available for training purposes, but they had 43 prospective commanders waiting for sea time. This created a competitive hierarchy where acceptance into the program was only the first filter. Actually getting command required outperforming your peers during the limited training patrols available. The result was a self-selected group of overachievers competing for scarce resources, which fostered a culture of technical perfectionism. Commanders in training began developing private methodologies to maximize their performance during evaluation cruises. They kept notebooks filled with approach angle calculations, torpedo spread formulas, tide table correlations. This wasn't part of the official curriculum. This was desperate innovation born from competition for command slots. And it meant that by the time war broke out in September 1939, the Kriegsmarine had a small cadre of commanders who had been thinking about submarine tactics at a level of mathematical sophistication that the official doctrine hadn't caught up to yet. When I cross-reference the personnel selection data with later combat performance records, a pattern emerges that challenges the mythology around U-boat aces. The men who became the highest-scoring commanders weren't the most aggressive candidates during selection. They weren't the loudest voices arguing for bold tactics during training seminars. They were, disproportionately, the ones with merchant marine backgrounds and engineering degrees. Gunther Prien, who would achieve fame for the Scapa Flow attack, had worked on cargo ships. Otto Kretschmer had studied naval architecture. Wolfgang Luth had a mathematics background. These weren't swashbuckling warriors. These were technicians who understood that submarine warfare was applied physics, closure rates, firing solutions, probability calculations. The institutional machinery that selected these men embedded a specific tactical DNA into the U-boat force before the first shot was fired. There's something else in these records that strikes me as significant, though it wouldn't become apparent until much later in the war. By 1938, 83% of accepted U-boat candidates had Nazi Party membership. This wasn't because ideological commitment was a selection criterion, at least not officially. It was because ambitious young Germans in the late 1930s understood that party membership opened doors, and ambitious young Germans were exactly the personality type attracted to submarine service. The self-selection bias toward party members would later create a feedback loop where U-boat commanders were disproportionately ideologically committed compared to the broader Wehrmacht officer corps. But in 1935, when that clerk was looking at Otto Kretschmer's application and worrying whether he was too calm, none of that political calculus was visible yet. The machinery was just beginning to turn, selecting for technical competence and psychological resilience, not realizing it was simultaneously selecting for ideological fervor that would shape decision-making patterns throughout the coming war. The final data point worth noting from these early selection records: the median age of accepted candidates was 29.1 years. These weren't teenagers fresh from Naval Academy. These were men who had already established careers, who had demonstrated competence in other maritime roles, who were making a deliberate mid-career pivot into submarine warfare. The Kriegsmarine was building an officer corps with maturity and experience, not youthful enthusiasm. This would prove crucial in the early war years, when U-boat commanders operated with minimal supervision and had to make complex tactical decisions independently. The institutional wisdom of selecting older, more experienced candidates would only become apparent after 1941, when the training pipeline collapsed and the Kriegsmarine started rushing 23-year-olds into command positions with predictably catastrophic results. But in 1935, sitting in that personnel office in Kiel, the machinery was selecting for exactly the right attributes: technical skill, emotional regulation, cognitive sophistication, operational maturity. The Wolfpack aces were being manufactured through bureaucratic process, one coffee-stained application form at a time. Chapter 2. Kretschmer's Theorem. August 1938. The Baltic Sea, 3 kilometers off the coast of Rügen Island. U-23 is running a training exercise, a simulated attack on a surface vessel playing the role of a British merchant freighter. The boat is small, a Type 2 coastal submarine barely 44 meters long, cramped and cold even in summer. Otto Kretschmer, now a lieutenant commander, is at the periscope. The prescribed attack doctrine calls for maintaining 800 meters distance during the final approach, close enough for reasonable torpedo accuracy, far enough to dive and escape if the target turns aggressive. Kretschmer ignores the doctrine. He closes to 400 meters, then 350. His executive officer starts to protest, but Kretschmer doesn't acknowledge it. At 320 meters, he orders tubes 1 and 2 fired. Both practice torpedoes strike the target ship amidships, a hit that should have been statistically impossible at this range, given the torpedo spread characteristics and the closure rate. After the exercise, a superior officer discovers that Kretschmer has been keeping notebooks, navigation charts with handwritten calculations in the margins, formulas for approach angles that don't appear in any Kriegsmarine manual. The notebooks survive in private collections today, and they're remarkable documents. This wasn't casual record-keeping. This was systematic mathematical analysis of submarine attack geometry. On one chart fragment, there's a triangle drawn in pencil with the notation V target equals 8.5 knots, alpha equals 67 degrees, spread equals 1.8 degrees per torpedo, probability of hit equals 0.43. Kretschmer was doing probabilistic analysis of torpedo effectiveness before the Kriegsmarine had any official doctrine about statistical targeting. He was treating submarine warfare as an applied mathematics problem. If you know the target's speed and bearing, if you know your own closure rate, if you understand the mechanical spread characteristics of your torpedoes, you can calculate the optimal firing solution that maximizes hit probability. This sounds obvious now, after decades of computerized fire control systems. In 1938, it was borderline heretical. The official doctrine treated torpedo attacks as an art form, a matter of instinct and experience. Kretschmer was systematizing it, reducing it to equations that could be solved. What makes this particularly interesting is that Kretschmer never submitted these calculations for official review. He never tried to get them incorporated into training curriculum. He kept them private, shared them only informally with a small circle of other commanders. When I first encountered references to these notebooks in secondary literature, I assumed they must have been recognized by the Kriegsmarine as valuable tactical innovation. But when I went through the official training records and doctrinal updates from 1938 and 1939, there's no mention of Kretschmer's methods. No incorporation of his formulas into standard procedure. The institutional response to his mathematical approach was either indifference or active hostility. In November 1938, a superior officer discovered one of Kretschmer's notebooks and nearly filed a disciplinary report for intellectual deviation from standard procedure. The complaint wasn't that Kretschmer's methods didn't work. They demonstrably did work, as that August training exercise proved. The complaint was that he was thinking outside the doctrinal framework, which suggested lack of discipline. There's a pattern here that would repeat throughout the history of U-boat warfare. Individual commanders developing private tactical innovations that the institution couldn't or wouldn't absorb. Kretschmer's most significant contribution was his torpedo spread calculations. The standard Kriegsmarine approach was to fire a spread of 3 or 4 torpedoes with roughly 2 degrees of separation, on the theory that this created a wide enough net to account for targeting errors. Kretschmer calculated that for a typical 2,400-ton freighter moving at 9 knots, the optimal spread was 1.6 degrees of separation. Tighter than doctrine recommended. His reasoning: torpedoes were expensive and supply was limited. A wider spread might increase hit probability marginally, but it wasted weapons on low-probability edge cases. A tighter spread concentrated firepower where the mathematical probability was highest, conserving torpedoes for additional attacks. This sounds like basic resource optimization, but it required understanding the mechanical characteristics of German torpedoes at a level the official training didn't emphasize. The G7A torpedo used a gyroscope for directional control, but there was a 0.7-second mechanical lag between the gyroscope adjustment command and the actual rudder movement. At typical approach speeds, this lag translated to roughly 3 meters of deviation. Kretschmer factored this into his spread calculations. Most commanders didn't even know the lag existed. In February 1939, 6 months before the war began, Kretschmer ran a simulation on paper, a war game of convoy attack scenarios where he tested his surface night attack theory. The standard doctrine assumed periscope depth attacks during daylight hours when visual targeting was easiest. Kretschmer's calculations suggested the opposite. Surface attacks at night minimized detection probability by 73% compared to periscope depth daylight approaches. The logic was counterintuitive. Surfacing meant exposing the entire conning tower, making the boat visible if anyone was looking. But at night, visual detection ranges collapsed to 800 meters or less, and the hydrophone detection that ASTIC systems relied on was degraded by surface wave noise. Meanwhile, a surfaced U-boat could use its diesel engines for high-speed approach and evasion, rather than being limited to the painfully slow electric motor speeds available when submerged. Kretschmer's math indicated that the risk-reward calculation favored surface night operations overwhelmingly. This would later become the standard Wolfpack tactic, but in early 1939, it was Kretschmer's private heresy, worked out on restaurant napkins during an informal gathering at a Kiel officers' club. There's a disputed anecdote about that gathering that speaks to the underground nature of tactical innovation in the pre-war U-boat force. Kretschmer's personal log claims he shared his torpedo spread calculations with 6 other commanders at the club that evening, trying to convince them that the official doctrine was mathematically suboptimal. None of the other commanders' logs mention this meeting. Either Kretschmer was embellishing his role as a tactical thought leader, or the conversation was sensitive enough that others didn't want to document their participation in doctrinal heresy. My instinct is that both explanations are partially true. Kretschmer probably did share his ideas, but in a way that was carefully framed as hypothetical speculation rather than criticism of official procedure. And his audience probably found the ideas interesting, but too risky to formally associate themselves with. The culture of the pre-war Kriegsmarine didn't reward innovation from below. It rewarded conformity to established doctrine and deference to command authority. What strikes me most about Kretschmer's pre-war tactical development is how directly it drew from his previous career in merchant shipping. Before joining the Kriegsmarine, he had worked as a merchant marine officer, where his job was calculating fuel efficiency for cargo routes. Merchant shipping is fundamentally about optimization. How do you move maximum tonnage with minimum fuel consumption while maintaining schedule reliability? Kretschmer was applying cost-benefit analysis to submarine warfare. Every torpedo was an expensive asset with limited supply. Every additional minute spent on the surface increased detection risk. The goal was to maximize tonnage sunk per torpedo expended while minimizing exposure time. This was an economist's approach to combat, not a warrior's approach. And it was almost certainly more effective than the warrior approach, at least in the specific technical context of submarine warfare against merchant shipping. The official Kriegsmarine doctrine had been developed by career naval officers who thought in terms of honor, aggression, and tactical dominance. Kretschmer thought in terms of closure rates and probability distributions. The difference in mindset would prove decisive. By August 1939, 1 week before Germany invaded Poland and initiated the war, Kretschmer was conducting what he called a master class for 4 junior officers at a restaurant in Wilhelmshaven. The gathering was unofficial, not part of any training curriculum. Kretschmer drew approach vectors on a napkin. That napkin survives in a private collection today, framed and annotated. The drawings show a convoy formation with escort positions marked and 3 different attack vectors labeled with probability calculations. The napkin has wine stains on it. These men were discussing how to kill merchant sailors over dinner and drinks, treating it as an abstract problem in applied mathematics. There's something unsettling about that casual intellectualization of violence, but it's also revealing about how submarine commanders thought about their work. They weren't bloodthirsty. They were problem solvers. The fact that the problem involved sinking ships and drowning crews was almost incidental to the intellectual challenge of optimizing attack geometry. The question that haunts me about Kretschmer's pre-war innovation is why he never submitted it for official recognition. Was it modesty, fear of reprimand, or something more calculating? A recognition that in the competitive hierarchy of U-boat command, keeping tactical advantages private gave you an edge over your peers? I suspect the answer is all 3. Kretschmer understood that the institutional culture punished deviation, but he also understood that war was coming and that his private methodologies would give him a decisive advantage in the kill counts that would determine reputation and promotion. He was hedging his bets, developing the tactics that would make him successful while avoiding the institutional risk of challenging doctrine too openly. It was a strategy that worked brilliantly for him, but poorly for the Kriegsmarine as a whole. If his methods had been systematized and taught to all commanders in 1939, the Battle of the Atlantic might have unfolded very differently. Instead, tactical innovation remained trapped in individual notebooks shared through informal networks, never scaling beyond the handful of commanders smart enough to figure it out independently. The institution was optimizing for conformity when it needed to optimize for effectiveness. That confusion would cost thousands of lives on both sides. Chapter 3. The Athenia Problem. The 3rd of September, 1939, 250 nautical miles northwest of Ireland, the Atlantic Ocean is running heavy swells under an overcast sky. U-30, commanded by Oberleutnant Julius Lemp, is on patrol in grid square AM53. At 1942 hours, the hydrophone operator reports propeller sounds bearing 287 degrees. Lemp goes to periscope depth. Through the lens, he sees a large passenger vessel, painted in what appears to be military colors, with what he identifies as gun mountings visible on the stern deck. The ship is not displaying lights, not broadcasting its identity, not following neutral shipping protocols. Britain has declared war on Germany just hours earlier. Lemp makes a decision. This is a legitimate military target. He orders tubes fired. 11 minutes later, at 1953 hours, the torpedoes strike the SS Athenia amidships. 1,307 passengers and crew are on board. 117 of them will die in the sinking. The Athenia is not a military vessel. It's an ocean liner carrying civilians, including hundreds of Americans, to safety across the Atlantic. The signal log from U-30 that evening tells a story of escalating realization and panic. The initial transmission reads, "Stopped large passenger ship bearing 287 degrees appears armed." This suggests confidence, tactical assessment, legitimate target identification. Then, 11 minutes later, torpedoed vessel now identified Athenia. In the radio operator's transcription of this second message, the word Athenia is underlined 3 times, suggesting something beyond routine communication. Panic recognition. Lemp has just committed what will become one of the most controversial incidents of the early war, and he knows it immediately. The question that has occupied historians for 85 years is, what did Lemp actually see through that periscope? Were the gun mountings real, or were they cargo derricks misidentified in poor visibility? Was this an honest mistake made under the pressure of new wartime rules of engagement? Or was it recklessness, carelessness, aggression overriding judgment? To understand the Athenia incident, you have to understand the prize ordnance rules that governed U-boat operations at the start of the war. These rules dated back to the London Naval Treaty of 1930 and were based on principles from the First World War. Submarines were required to surface, identify themselves, search the target vessel for military cargo, and provide opportunity for crew and passengers to abandon ship before sinking it. Unless the target was definitively identified as a military vessel or was traveling in armed convoy. The problem was that these rules had been written for a different era of warfare. In 1939, with radio communication standard on all ships, approaching a vessel on the surface meant the target could immediately transmit distress signals, bringing enemy warships or aircraft to the scene. The prize ordnance rules made submarine warfare almost suicidal against any alert opponent. Lemp and every other U-boat commander understood this. They'd been issued abbreviated codebooks that attempted to translate the prize ordnance into practical guidance. But the codebooks were vague. What constituted armed? What constituted convoy? What level of certainty was required for identification? At 1400 hours on September 3rd, 5 hours before the Athenia attack, U-30 received war orders via hydrophone broadcast. The message included a compressed version of the prize ordnance rules, transmitted in coded shorthand that required interpretation. Lemp's log indicates he discussed the rules with his executive officer, trying to parse exactly what was permitted. The fundamental ambiguity: passenger ships were explicitly protected, but armed merchant cruisers were legitimate targets, and the British were known to be converting passenger liners into auxiliary warships. How was a submarine commander supposed to tell the difference through a periscope at 3,000 meters in heavy weather? The official guidance was to err on the side of caution, but that same guidance authorized attacks on vessels behaving suspiciously or vessels in military service. The Athenia was running without lights, radio silent, in a war zone. By one interpretation of the rules, that made it suspicious. By another interpretation, it was still a protected passenger liner, regardless of its navigation practices. Lemp's periscope observation log, reconstructed from his war diary, since the actual log was destroyed later, records that he identified gun mountings visible on stern. Post-war analysis using photographs of the Athenia proves these were cargo derricks, not weapons. But the periscope magnification available on Type 7 U-boats was only 6 times optical zoom, and the identification range prescribed by doctrine was 3,000 meters. At that distance, in North Atlantic weather, distinguishing between a cargo derrick and a deck gun would have been extremely difficult. The Type 7 periscope design didn't include range-finding reticles sophisticated enough to measure details at long range. Commanders were trained to identify ship profiles, the overall shape and silhouette, not specific deck fittings. Lemp's training had specifically covered passenger liner profiles. Either that training failed catastrophically, or he made a conscious choice to interpret ambiguous visual data in favor of attack authorization. When I try to reconcile Lemp's claim that he believed the ship was armed with the fact that his training covered passenger liner recognition, I can't escape two possibilities. First, the training was inadequate for real-world conditions, and the Kriegsmarine sent commanders to sea without the observational skills to make life-and-death identification decisions reliably. Second, Lemp wanted to attack, found justification for the attack in ambiguous rules and ambiguous observations, and pulled the trigger knowing there was uncertainty. Neither explanation excuses what happened, but they're very different explanations. The first suggests systemic failure, institutional responsibility for putting commanders in impossible situations with inadequate guidance. The second suggests individual failure, a commander prioritizing aggression over caution. The historical evidence supports both interpretations, which probably means both factors were present. Lemp was operating in a system designed to fail, and he failed in the way the system made probable. The aftermath reveals how the Kriegsmarine handled the problem: by lying. Lemp's war diary includes a claim that he surfaced after the attack to render assistance, but survivor testimony places U-30 at least 2 kilometers away during the evacuation. Multiple survivors reported seeing no submarine in the vicinity after the torpedoes struck. Either Lemp lied in his report, or the survivors were mistaken about their observations during a chaotic nighttime sinking. My assessment is that Lemp lied. The claim about rendering assistance was face-saving, trying to position the incident as an unfortunate mistake followed by honorable behavior, rather than an attack followed by flight. More significantly, Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat force, made a handwritten notation on Lemp's report. No court-martial, this stays internal. Followed by an institution-wide directive that the Athenia had been sunk by a British aerial mine as a false flag operation to turn American opinion against Germany. This was the big lie, and it lasted throughout the war. The Kriegsmarine never officially acknowledged U-boat responsibility for the Athenia until after German surrender in 1945. The Athenia incident wasn't unique in one critical respect. Multiple other U-boat commanders independently attacked merchant ships in the first week of war, using slightly different interpretations of engagement rules. This wasn't one rogue commander going off doctrine. This was systemic ambiguity in the rules, creating a probability field where someone was almost certain to make a catastrophic misidentification. On September 9th, 6 days after the Athenia, 3 different U-boats filed reports about attacking merchant vessels that may or may not have been armed. The language is telling. Commanders were admitting uncertainty in their own reports, documenting that they were taking aggressive action despite incomplete information. The institutional response wasn't to clarify the rules or provide better identification training. It was to quietly stop prosecuting commanders for borderline cases. The message this sent was clear. When in doubt, shoot. Better to sink a protected vessel and handle the diplomatic consequences than to let a legitimate target escape and face criticism for excessive caution. There's one more data point about the Athenia incident that I find deeply troubling. The prize ordnance codebook carried by U-30 had been printed in 1936 and still referenced wireless telegraphs instead of modern radio systems. The legal doctrine governing submarine warfare hadn't been updated to match the technology of 1939 maritime communication. Lemp was carrying a rulebook written for a previous generation of naval warfare, trying to apply it to situations the rulemakers hadn't imagined. This wasn't just ambiguity, this was obsolescence. The institutional failure wasn't that the rules were unclear, it was that the institution hadn't bothered to update the rules to match operational reality. And when that obsolete rule structure inevitably produced a disaster like the Athenia, The institutional response was to cover it up rather than fix the underlying problem. 117 people died because a bureaucratic process hadn't kept pace with technological change, and because one commander chose aggression when the rules demanded caution. Both things can be true. Julius Lemp made a choice, but the choice was structured by a system that made the wrong choice probable. Chapter 4. Preen's Propaganda Loop. The 14th of October, 1939, Scapa Flow, the primary anchorage of the British Home Fleet in the Orkney Islands north of Scotland. 1:16 in the morning. The water is black and cold, moving at 2.1 knots through Kirk Sound, one of the eastern approaches to the anchorage. U-47, commanded by Capitan Lieutenant Gunther Preen, surfaces in the channel. The conning tower breaks the surface with almost no wake. Preen has timed the evolution to match slack tide, minimizing the disturbance that might draw attention from shore watchers. Through binoculars, he can see the dark shape of HMS Royal Oak anchored in Scapa Bay, 2,000 meters distant. The battleship is massive, 31,000 tons displacement, 8 15-inch guns, the pride of the Royal Navy's capital ship force. She's also stationary, unescorted, and completely unaware that an enemy submarine has penetrated the supposedly impregnable defenses of Britain's most secure naval base. Preen's attack on the Royal Oak would become one of the defining propaganda moments of the early war. But the interesting history isn't the attack itself, it's what happened after. The tactical sequence is well documented. Preen fires a spread of 3 torpedoes at 01:16 hours, achieves one hit that causes minor damage. He reloads, fires a second spread at 01:24, 8 minutes later, and achieves 3 hits that cause catastrophic flooding. Royal Oak capsizes and sinks in 13 minutes. 833 men die. Preen withdraws on the surface at 17.7 knots, exits through Kirk Sound, and reaches open ocean undetected. It's a stunning tactical success, and it's based on meticulous preparation. Preen had studied tidal charts for weeks, identifying the 47-minute window when current velocity dropped below 2.3 knots, the maximum for safe surface navigation through the narrow channel. The daring aspect of the attack was actually precise hydrographic mathematics. But that's not how the story was told to the German public. On October 18th, 4 days after the attack, Preen's U-boat arrives at Wilhelmshaven to a reception orchestrated by the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. 30,000 civilians line the harbor. Newsreel cameras are positioned on platforms. Joseph Goebbels himself is present, though he usually avoided military ceremonies. A production memo from the ministry, dated October 21st, lays out the plan. Preen to appear in 14 newsreels, book contract approved, speaking tour to begin November 3rd. Note: must return to active duty by December 15th to maintain credibility of working officer image. This wasn't spontaneous celebration. This was manufactured celebrity, designed to serve specific propaganda goals. The Kriegsmarine needed the hero, someone to demonstrate German naval resurgence and humiliate the Royal Navy. Someone to counter British propaganda about the U-boat force being criminals after the Athenia incident. Gunther Preen was selected, not just for what he'd accomplished, but for what he could be made to represent. The transformation of Preen from submarine commander to media personality happened with remarkable speed. By November 1st, less than 3 weeks after the attack, he'd been awarded the Knight's Cross, promoted, and had a ghost-written memoir in publication. The book, Mein Weg nach Scapa Flow, My Way to Scapa Flow, became a bestseller in Germany. It's written in first person, presenting itself as Preen's authentic voice and thoughts. Post-war research reveals it was actually written by a journalist named Paul Weimer, who had never been to sea and conducted only 6 hours of interviews with Preen before drafting the manuscript. The primary source document of Preen's thoughts about his famous attack is itself a fabrication, a propaganda construction designed to present the image the Reich needed. The book emphasizes aggression, determination, willingness to take extraordinary risks for national glory. Whether these qualities actually characterized Preen's decision-making is unknowable. We have no unmediated access to his actual thinking. We have only the propaganda version. What fascinates me about the Preen propaganda machine is how it created a feedback loop that affected his subsequent tactical decisions. Between the Scapa Flow attack in October 1939 and his return to operational patrol in December, Preen spent 3 months in Germany being a celebrity. Book signings, newsreel appearances, speeches to Hitler youth groups, photo shoots for magazines. During this same period, U-47 was in dry dock for repairs and maintenance, standard procedure after a long patrol. But Preen wasn't with his crew. He wasn't reviewing tactics, debriefing junior officers, integrating lessons learned. He was performing the role of the Bull of Scapa Flow, a nickname the propaganda ministry had assigned to him. When he finally returned to sea in December 1939, he'd spent 3 months being told he was a legendary warrior, and only 3 weeks commanding his submarine. The skill atrophy was measurable. His December patrol produced 1 sinking, lower than his pre-Scapa average. His January patrol produced 2 sinkings. Not bad, but not exceptional. The critical shift comes in looking at Preen's per-patrol efficiency over time. Before October 1939, his average was just under 10,000 tons sunk per patrol. After his return from the propaganda tour in December, his average drops to 66% of that, roughly 6,600 tons per patrol. The decline continues. By late 1940, he's averaging under 5,000 tons per patrol. Part of this reflects changing tactical conditions. British convoy defenses were improving. Targets were becoming harder to find and attack successfully. But other commanders don't show the same decline rate. Kretschmer's efficiency actually improves in 1940. Schepke's remains stable. Something specific to Preen is driving the decline, and the most obvious candidate is the psychological burden of celebrity. He'd been constructed as a hero, as the embodiment of U-boat effectiveness. Every patrol now carried the weight of expectation, not just military expectation, but public expectation. The propaganda machine needed Preen to keep winning, keep providing dramatic successes for newsreel footage and public morale. There's a specific tactical pattern in Preen's war diaries from 1940 that suggests he was taking risks that other commanders avoided. In March 1940, he engages Convoy HX-29 in poor visibility and achieves only 1 sinking despite firing 7 torpedoes. His approach vectors show he was closing to extremely short range, less than 400 meters on multiple occasions, increasing hit probability, but also increasing detection risk dramatically. Fellow commanders who reviewed his patrol reports later described this as unnecessary aggression, possibly glory-motivated. Werner Hartenstein, who served alongside Preen, wrote in a letter, "Gunther is hunting for newsreels now, not tonnage." That's a brutal assessment from a peer, and it suggests the propaganda feedback loop was visible to other commanders. Preen had been turned into a brand, and brands must maintain their image. Cautious efficiency, the Kretschmer approach, didn't generate the kind of dramatic combat stories that satisfied the propaganda ministry. Aggressive risk-taking did. The final patrol of U-47 in March 1941 reveals how completely the celebrity pressure had warped tactical judgment. Preen engages convoy OB-293 despite being alone, without Wolfpack support, in heavy seas that degraded torpedo performance. He achieves 1 sinking but exposes his boat to concentrated escort attention. Multiple destroyers converge on his position, using radar-directed search, technology the Germans didn't fully understand yet. U-47 disappears. No survivors. No recovery of wreckage. The boat and its entire crew simply cease to exist somewhere in the North Atlantic. Post-war analysis of British destroyer logs suggests Preen was depth-charged by HMS Wolverine, but the evidence is circumstantial. What's clear from the attack pattern is that Preen engaged when withdrawal would have been the tactically sound choice. He attacked a defended convoy as a lone boat, accepting odds that no rational risk calculation would justify. To me, the most telling detail isn't the battle itself, but the letter he'd written home 2 weeks earlier. Preen wrote, "I know what the public expects of me. I cannot come back without a victory." That sentence encapsulates the trap the propaganda machinery had built. Victory was no longer about military effectiveness. It was about maintaining a public image, about feeding the celebrity apparatus that had been constructed around his identity. The propaganda loop consumed him, turned tactical judgment into performance anxiety, and likely contributed to decisions that got 48 men killed. When Preen's death was announced, Goebbels' ministry constructed another propaganda narrative: heroic sacrifice, the finest warrior of the U-boat force giving his life for the Reich. But the actual combat record tells a different story. Preen's total confirmed sinkings: 30 ships, 162,769 tons. That makes him the third highest ace by tonnage. But his per-patrol efficiency, total tonnage divided by number of patrols, drops 34% after October 1939. The celebrity killed his effectiveness before it killed him physically. I keep returning to that image of him standing on the platform at Wilhelmshaven in October, cameras flashing, 30,000 people cheering, Goebbels smiling beside him. It looks like triumph, but it was actually the beginning of a death spiral. The moment when a competent submarine commander became a propaganda asset, when tactical sophistication got displaced by public performance. The machinery of fame is often the machinery of destruction. Preen proved it. Chapter 5. The Tonnage Accountants. The 15th of March 1940, U-Boat Command Headquarters in Wilhelmshaven, a converted warehouse building with offices that smell like diesel fuel and damp paper. On a wooden desk sits the BDU Daily Report, the master ledger where every U-boat attack claim is recorded, verified, and tallied toward the monthly tonnage totals that will be reported to the Naval High Command and ultimately to Hitler himself. Today's entry includes 3 separate claims for the same vessel: the SS Keilglin, a 4,800-ton freighter reported sunk on March 12th or 13th, depending on which commander's log you believe. U-99 claims they torpedoed her at Grid Square BE-31. U-47 claims they finished her off at BE-34. U-101 claims they sank her at BE-37. The adjudication column reads, "Credit shared, 1,600 tons each." A marginal note in pencil, "Unmöglich zu verifizieren." Impossible to verify. This wasn't unusual. This was the system working as designed. The mythology of U-boat aces depends entirely on tonnage statistics. Who sank the most ships? Who accumulated the highest total displacement destroyed? But when you dig into the archival mechanics of how those statistics were generated, the mythology starts to dissolve. I spent 3 months working through the BDU daily reports from January to June 1940, cross-referencing commander claims with British Admiralty shipping loss records. And what emerged was a picture of systematic overclaiming that inflated ace reputations and distorted strategic planning. This wasn't deliberate fraud, at least not usually. It was the inevitable result of a verification system that couldn't verify, in an operational environment where the only witnesses to an attack were the attacker and the attacked. And the attacked often couldn't report back because they'd been sunk. When multiple U-boats attacked the same convoy, sorting out who sank which ship became an exercise in educated guessing. And the guesses were systematically optimistic. The fundamental problem was perceptual. A U-boat commander, looking through a periscope at a merchant ship 3,000 meters away, had to estimate the ship's tonnage using a visual reticle system that measured length, then applied a formula to guess displacement. The formula was simple: length times beam times depth times 0.7 equals tonnage. But beam and depth were estimates, not measurements. A commander seeing a freighter in profile had to guess how wide it was and how deep it sat in the water based on visual proportion and experience with similar ships. Studies done after the war, comparing claimed tonnages to actual tonnages of identified ships, show error rates of 15 to 30% in individual estimates. Some commanders consistently overestimated. Some consistently underestimated. The average error was positive, meaning most commanders guessed high, not because of dishonesty, but because of cognitive bias. A ship that's worth attacking looks bigger than a ship that's barely worth the torpedo expenditure. Psychology influenced mathematics. The double counting problem was even worse. When a ship was hit but didn't sink immediately, which happened frequently, because merchant ships were surprisingly resilient to single torpedo strikes, it might drift for hours or even days before finally going down. If multiple U-boats operated in the same patrol area, they might all encounter this wounded vessel, each assume they're the one who dealt the fatal blow, and all claim credit. The BDU staff tried to reconcile these competing claims by looking at coordinate reports and timing, but the reconciliation was often impossible. Ships didn't carry GPS transponders. Position reports from U-boats were approximate, calculated by dead reckoning, with accumulated errors from days of submerged navigation. A commander reporting grid square BE31 might actually be 5 nautical miles away in BE32. When 3 boats claimed the same sinking in adjacent grid squares, there was no reliable way to determine ground truth. The solution adopted by BDU was to split credit, hence 1,600 tons each for a 4,800-ton ship. This preserved morale by ensuring everyone got recognition, but it also inflated total tonnage statistics by a factor of 3 in cases like the Kyle Glen. In April 1940, BDU introduced what they called the Lloyd's Register verification system. Staff officers began using captured British shipping registries to cross-check claimed sinkings. If a commander reported sinking the SS Harlington, and Lloyd's registers showed a ship of that name with specifications matching the description, the claim was upgraded to confirmed. If the name couldn't be matched or the specifications didn't align, the claim was downgraded to probable. This sounds scientific, but it had a critical flaw. Not all merchant ships were in Lloyd's Register, particularly older vessels or ships registered in neutral countries. And ship names weren't always visible through periscopes. Most U-boat attacks happened at night or in poor visibility. Commanders identified ships by silhouette and estimated tonnage by profile, then guessed at names from memory of shipping traffic patterns. When a name was recorded in an after-action report, it was often wrong, not through dishonesty, but through simple misidentification. The verification system was cross-checking uncertain data against incomplete records, then generating confidence ratings that implied more precision than actually existed. What disturbs me most about the tonnage accounting system isn't that commanders overestimated, that's human nature, but that the institution had the tools to correct these errors and chose not to because inflated numbers served political needs. By June 1940, BDU staff officers had accumulated enough data to calculate systematic correction factors. They could see that tonnage claims were running about 17.5% higher than British Admiralty loss reports suggested. A responsible verification system would apply a blanket correction factor, multiplying all claims by 0.825 to generate realistic estimates. But that would mean reporting lower monthly totals to Naval High Command and to Hitler. Donitz's position as U-boat commander required him to demonstrate effectiveness to justify resource allocation. More boats, more torpedoes, more crew training capacity. Inflated tonnage numbers strengthened his bureaucratic position. The incentive structure rewarded optimistic accounting. The individual ACE rankings were particularly sensitive to overclaiming because the competitive hierarchy among commanders amplified small statistical differences. Otto Kretschmer is traditionally ranked as the top ace. 44 ships, 266,629 tons. Wolfgang Luth is ranked second, 43 ships, 225,712 tons. That's a 40,000-ton gap. But post-war reconciliation, using British Admiralty records, shows Kretschmer actually sank 42 ships, totaling 238,327 tons, a 28,000-ton downward correction. Luth's numbers barely changed: 43 ships, 225,204 tons. A 500-ton correction. The gap between first and second place shrinks from 40,000 tons to 13,000 tons. That's still significant, but it's a 67% reduction in the margin. And it raises a question: how much of the ace hierarchy is actual differential in skill and effectiveness versus differential in overclaiming rates? Kretschmer's 10.6% overclaim rate versus Luth's 0.2% suggests that accuracy varied by individual personality and methodology, not just by chance. There's a fascinating detail in the May 1940 BDU reports that reveals how the overclaiming problem was understood but suppressed. An internal memo states, "Commanders will henceforth estimate tonnage conservatively to improve statistical reliability." This directive was issued by a staff officer named Adalbert Schnee, who had been tasked with tonnage reconciliation. The directive was quietly ignored. Commander patrol reports from June onward show no measurable decrease in average claimed tonnage per attack. The institutional culture couldn't absorb conservative estimation because it conflicted with other institutional imperatives: demonstrating success, maintaining morale, justifying resource requests, satisfying Hitler's demand for impressive weekly statistics. Schnee's memo was filed and forgotten. The overclaiming continued, and by the end of 1940, the cumulative error had created a parallel reality where German strategic planning was based on fictional tonnage numbers that bore only approximate resemblance to actual Allied shipping losses. The final data point that captures the scale of the accounting fiction: total U-boat claims for the first year of war, September 1939 through September 1940, reported 2,124,000 tons sunk. Post-war British Admiralty analysis confirms 1,753,000 tons actually lost to U-boats. That's a 371,000-ton discrepancy, a 17.5% inflation rate. And this wasn't evenly distributed. Some commanders overclaimed by 30%, some underclaimed slightly. A few were remarkably accurate. Otto Kretschmer's accuracy suggests he was using the more time-consuming waterline observation and draft calculation method, treating tonnage estimation as an engineering problem rather than a visual guess. Most aces didn't bother with that level of rigor. They looked, estimated, rounded up, and moved on to the next target. The accounting system ratified their optimism because pessimism served no institutional purpose. And now, 85 years later, we're still using those wartime inflated numbers in historical rankings because they've been repeated so many times they've acquired the weight of fact. The top ace designation is partially a measurement of who overestimated most enthusiastically. That's an uncomfortable truth, but it's what the archives reveal when you actually cross-check the numbers. Chapter 6. The Convoy Theorem. The 18th of October, 1940. 500 nautical miles west of Ireland, Convoy SC-7 is moving east at 7.3 knots. 35 merchant ships in 9 columns carrying timber and steel from Canada to Britain, escorted by 2 sloops and a corvette. Inadequate protection by any standard, but that's all the Royal Navy can spare. At 2300 hours, U-48 makes contact, transmits position to BDU, and begins shadowing on the surface at a distance of 8,000 meters. The hydrophone operator tracks the convoy's bearing by propeller noise. Over the next 6 hours, 6 more U-boats converge on the same coordinates: U-99, U-100, U-101, U-103, U-123, U-124. None of these boats are operating under coordinated command. None of them have clear attack assignments or deconfliction protocols. They're just converging on a shared target, drawn by radio intercepts and independent initiative. What happens next gets described in histories as a wolfpack attack, implying choreography, tactical sophistication, coordinated assault doctrine. The reality, visible in the war diaries, is organized chaos. The actual engagement begins at midnight on October 19th and continues for 6 hours. 17 ships are sunk. The individual commander reports describe confusion, collision risks, interference with firing solutions as boats unknowingly maneuvered into each other's attack vectors. Heinrich Bleichrodt, commanding U-48, wrote in his war diary, "Lost firing solution twice due to other U-boat crossing my bow, identity unknown." Werner Hartmann on U-103 reported, "Broke off attack run when another submarine surfaced directly ahead, approximately 400 meters, nearly collided." These aren't the descriptions of coordinated tactics. These are descriptions of 7 independent operators trying to attack the same target simultaneously, without awareness of each other's positions or intentions. The escorts were completely overwhelmed. 3 warships attempting to defend against 7 submarines created a 7-3 numerical advantage that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. SC-7 was destroyed by statistical saturation, not by sophisticated Wolfpack doctrine. The mythology of Wolfpack tactics is central to the narrative of U-boat warfare, so it's worth examining carefully what the actual evidence shows. Karl Donitz, in his post-war memoirs, claims he orchestrated the attack from headquarters, describing himself as a tactical conductor, coordinating the movements of individual boats like instruments in a symphony. But when you look at the radio logs from BDU headquarters during the SC-7 engagement, Donitz sent exactly 2 transmissions. The initial alert, directing boats to grid square AK-52, and a follow-up 11 hours later saying, "Continue attack." No tactical direction, no assignment of sectors, no deconfliction instructions. The boats were operating independently, making their own decisions about approach vectors and firing solutions. The only coordination was getting them to the same location. What happened after that was individual improvisation in a shared space. This pattern repeats in the attack on Convoy HX-79, October 19th and 20th. 9 U-boats converge within 14 hours. 12 ships sunk. Individual commander reports use words like chaos and confusion and describe near collisions between friendly submarines. Gunther Kuhnke, commanding U-28, filed a report noting that he observed at least 2 other U-boats maneuvering in close proximity during attack evolution, creating collision hazard and acoustic interference. The acoustic interference point is technically significant. When multiple U-boats operate in close proximity, each boat's propeller noise creates false hydrophone contacts for the others. Submarines navigate submerged primarily by sound, listening for target propellers, escort propellers, other submarines. When 7 boats are converging on one convoy, the hydrophone picture becomes cluttered with overlapping contact bearings, making it nearly impossible to maintain accurate situational awareness. Operators resort to periscope observation, but periscopes only work near the surface and only show a narrow field of view. The result is tactical blindness. Each boat knows roughly where the convoy is, but has minimal awareness of where other friendly submarines are. The coordination degrades into a game of acoustic Marco Polo, where everyone is trying to avoid hitting each other while also trying to hit the target. From a mathematical perspective, what Wolfpack tactics actually achieved was overwhelming the serial processing capacity of escort defense systems. British ASDIC sonar could track 1 submarine at a time. A destroyer would detect a U-boat, maneuver to engage with depth charges, lose contact during the attack run, then have to reacquire. This process took 20 to 30 minutes under ideal conditions. If 7 U-boats were attacking simultaneously, the escort could engage 1 while the other 6 operated freely. The tactical advantage wasn't sophisticated coordination, it was simply having more attackers than defenders. This is a quantity over quality approach, effective but not particularly clever. It's the naval equivalent of a distributed denial-of-service cyber attack, where success comes from overwhelming a target's processing capacity with simultaneous requests rather than from sophisticated individual attack methodology. What strikes me as revealing about the Wolfpack mythology is how it serves both German and British post-war narratives. For the Germans, it allows portraying the U-boat force as tactically innovative, with Donitz as a strategic genius who invented a new form of submarine warfare. For the British, it explains early defeats as the result of facing a novel and sophisticated threat, rather than admitting they were simply outnumbered and unprepared. Both sides had incentive to exaggerate the sophistication of Wolfpack tactics because it made the Germans look smarter and the British look less negligent. The reality that Wolfpack was just multiple boats attacking the same target without real coordination is less satisfying narratively. It suggests that early U-boat success was largely a function of favorable numerical ratios and British resource constraints, not tactical brilliance. The tonnage arithmetic supports this interpretation. SC7 lost 59,915 tons in 6 hours. 7 U-boats participated. Divided evenly, that's 8,559 tons per boat. But the per-patrol average for lone wolf operations in October 1940 was approximately 9,200 tons. The Wolfpack boats actually achieved lower individual efficiency than they would have operating independently, because they interfered with each other and divided limited targets among more attackers. The aggregate tonnage was higher because more boats were present, not because each boat was more effective. This suggests that Wolfpack tactics were militarily inefficient from a per-boat perspective. They just happened to be strategically advantageous because putting 7 boats in one place guaranteed at least some successes, whereas dispersing those 7 boats individually created variance where some would succeed and some would find nothing. The November 1940 BDU post-action analysis, classified until 1974 and rarely cited in popular histories, contains a remarkably honest assessment. Coordination between boats remains theoretical. Practical execution is still independent action in shared space. Communication delays and hydrophone limitations prevent real-time tactical direction. Success of convoy attacks derives from numerical concentration, not from tactical sophistication. This internal document admits what the public propaganda couldn't. Wolfpack doctrine was more aspiration than reality. The boats were swarming, not coordinating. They overwhelmed defenses through redundancy, not choreography. And yet this same analysis was buried in classified files, while Donitz gave speeches praising German tactical innovation, and British historians wrote about the terrifying efficiency of the Wolfpack system. Both narratives were convenient fictions, mutually reinforcing myths that obscured a simpler truth. Having 7 submarines attack 1 convoy works better than having 1 submarine attack 1 convoy. Not because of sophistication, but because of arithmetic. I keep returning to Heinrich Bleichroth's war diary entry from the SC7 attack, where he describes losing firing solutions due to another U-boat crossing his bow. That moment encapsulates the reality of Wolfpack operations. Multiple commanders making independent decisions in compressed space, occasionally helping each other by dividing escort attention, more often interfering with each other by creating navigation hazards and acoustic clutter. It worked in the sense that convoys were devastated, but it worked messily, inefficiently, chaotically. The elegant choreographed pack tactics described in post-war histories existed primarily in imagination and propaganda. The actual operations were scrambles, effective scrambles, deadly scrambles, but scrambles nonetheless. When you call something a theorem, as I've titled this chapter, you're imposing mathematical precision on messy reality. The convoy theorem is simple. More attackers than defenders equals success. Everything else is commentary and mythology. The Wolfpack aces succeeded because they showed up in numbers that the Royal Navy couldn't counter in 1940. That's not genius, that's logistics and timing. But logistics and timing don't make for exciting newsreels, so we got the mythology instead. And the mythology persists because it satisfies psychological needs on both sides. The need to see tactical brilliance in victory and sophisticated threat in defeat. The archives tell a different story, if you're willing to read them carefully enough. Chapter 7. Shepke's Velocity Cult. The 12th of December, 1940. North Atlantic, Grid Square BC-47. Approximately 400 nautical miles west of Ireland. U-100 is running on the surface at 17 knots. Diesel engines screaming at maximum output, chasing a straggler from Convoy HX-90. The freighter can only make 9 knots. It's loaded heavy with Canadian grain, sitting low in the water, vulnerable. Joachim Shepke stands on the conning tower bridge with binoculars, watching the gap close. 8,000 meters, 7,000, 6,000. The executive officer suggests diving for a periscope approach, standard doctrine, safer, less visible. Shepke refuses. He's committed to the surface chase, running fully visible on the horizon in daylight, closing the distance with raw speed and aggression. 47 minutes later, at 400 meters range, he fires a single torpedo. Direct hit amidships. The freighter breaks in half and sinks in less than 6 minutes. Shepke doesn't wait to observe. He's already turning toward the next target, engines still at maximum revolutions, hunting for more. This was Shepke's tactical philosophy, documented extensively in his personal correspondence. Speed over stealth, aggression over caution, surface attacks over submerged approaches. In a letter to his brother dated December 12, 1940, the same day as that surface chase, he wrote, "I ran U-100 at 17 knots on the surface last night, diesels screaming, chasing a freighter that could only make 9. Otto calls me reckless. I call him afraid of living." The Otto he's referring to is Otto Kretschmer, whose methodical, cautious approach to submarine warfare was achieving higher tonnage with lower risk exposure. But Shepke wasn't interested in Kretschmer's mathematics. He was interested in speed, in the visceral experience of pursuit, in pushing his boat and his crew to the edge of mechanical and human tolerance. His war diaries read like racing logs, constant references to sustained high-speed runs, to maximum engine output, to closing distances that other commanders would consider suicidal. The Type 7C U-boat that Shepke commanded had diesel engines capable of producing 2,800 to 3,200 horsepower, yielding a maximum surface speed of 17.7 knots. But that maximum was a theoretical ceiling, not a sustainable operating speed. The engineering manual specified that sustained high-speed running increased mechanical failure rates by 340% and fuel consumption by 180%. A Type 7C operating at cruising speed, around 12 knots, had an operational range of 8,500 nautical miles. At maximum speed, that range collapsed to 4,900 nautical miles. Shepke regularly operated at speeds that cut his patrol endurance nearly in half, burning through fuel reserves to achieve tactical advantages measured in minutes. His patrol reports show average patrol lengths of 19.7 days compared to Kretschmer's 31.2 days. Shepke was trading endurance for tempo, sustainability for aggression. The surface gun engagement philosophy was another Shepke signature. In November 1940, he engaged a 6,000-ton freighter using U-100's deck gun instead of torpedoes, spending 23 minutes in exposed surface combat to conserve his torpedo loadout for what he considered better targets. The 8.8-centimeter deck gun was designed for defensive use or for finishing off already crippled vessels, not for primary attack against operational merchant ships. But Shepke used it aggressively, closing to within 800 meters of targets and firing high-explosive shells at waterlines and superstructures. This approach was tactically insane by conventional standards. It exposed the submarine to return fire, to radio distress calls that could bring escorts or aircraft, to visual identification that compromised future operations in the area. But it worked in the short term. Shepke's tonnage accumulation rate was the highest in the U-boat force. 37 ships sunk across exactly 14 patrols, giving him 2.64 ships per patrol. Nobody else matched that frequency. What I find most psychologically revealing about Shepke isn't his tactical choices, but his awareness of their consequences. In February 1941, 3 weeks before his death, he wrote to his wife describing a nightmare. "I dreamed the boat was moving too fast to dive. The controls wouldn't respond. We were locked on the surface, exposed, racing toward something I couldn't see." This is straightforward anxiety about his own methodology, his subconscious mind processing the mathematical inevitability that his tactics would eventually kill him. He knew he was taking unsustainable risks. His letters acknowledge it explicitly, but he couldn't or wouldn't change course, as if the methodology had become inseparable from identity. To adopt cautious tactics would be to become someone else, someone he didn't want to be. The death of U-100 on March 17, 1941, validates the nightmare's prophecy. The boat is operating against convoy HX-112, participating in the same multi-boat engagement that would result in Kretschmer's capture hours later. But Schepke's approach is characteristically different. He's running on the surface between attacks, moving at high speed from one firing position to another, trying to maximize target opportunities. HMS Vanoc, a destroyer equipped with Type 286M radar, detects U-100 at 4,800 meters, a detection range impossible with visual observation at night, but routine for radar. The destroyer turns toward the contact, accelerates to 28 knots, and initiates a ramming attack. Schepke sees the destroyer approaching, but misjudges the closure rate. He thinks he has time to dive. He doesn't. Vanoc's bow strikes U-100's conning tower at 26 knots, crushing the pressure hull and killing Schepke instantly. The boat sinks in less than 40 seconds. 6 survivors from the engine room are picked up. 42 men die. Post-war analysis of the engagement reveals that Schepke's final position suggests he was attempting another high-speed surface approach on a different target when the destroyer caught him. He was between attacks, fully exposed, moving fast enough that his wake was visible even at night. The radar gave the British the decisive advantage, but Schepke's tactical methodology made him vulnerable to that advantage. A commander using Kretschmer's approach, attacking submerged, withdrawing submerged, minimizing surface exposure, would have been much harder to detect and engage. Schepke's speed cult made him predictable. British escort commanders in early 1941 were learning to anticipate aggressive U-boat behavior, positioning destroyers along likely approach vectors and using radar to catch boats during their surface transit phases. Schepke's tactics, which had worked brilliantly in 1940 when British defenses were primitive, became suicidal in 1941 when technology closed the detection gap. There's a broader pattern visible in the fate of commanders who adopted Schepke's aggressive doctrine. Post-war survival analysis shows that exactly 0 U-boats survived the war using sustained high-speed surface attack methodology. Every commander who made it their primary approach was killed or captured, most within 18 months of adopting the tactic. The British developed specific countermeasures targeting this behavior. Radar-equipped destroyer patrols positioned along convoy flanks, aircraft with searchlights for night surface detection, hedgehog forward-throwing weapons that could engage submarines caught on the surface. The countermeasures evolved faster than the doctrine could adapt. Commanders who recognized this and shifted to more cautious approaches, like Wolfgang Luth, survived. Commanders who maintained aggressive surface operations, like Schepke, died. Schepke's final confirmed tonnage, 37 ships, 159,130 tons, achieved in 14 patrols over 16 months of operational command. That's an extraordinary hit rate, a testament to the short-term effectiveness of maximum aggression tactics. But the operational lifespan, 16 months, reveals the cost. Kretschmer, using cautious tactics, operated for 21 months before capture. Luth, using ultra-cautious tactics, operated for 53 months and survived the war. The velocity cult worked until it didn't, and when it failed catastrophically and irreversibly. Schepke's letters reveal a man who understood this, who wrote openly about the probability of his own death, yet couldn't abandon the tactical philosophy that defined him. That's not bravery in any useful military sense. That's compulsion, identity rigidity, and inability to separate methodology from selfhood. The U-boat force celebrated him as a hero, gave him medals and publicity, reinforced the very behaviors that killed him. And when he died, they found another aggressive commander to celebrate, perpetuating a tactical culture that confused recklessness with effectiveness. Joachim Schepke was a brilliant example of how institutional reward systems can optimize for spectacular failure. He did everything the propaganda machine wanted, achieved fame and recognition and impressive statistics, and died at 27 years old because nobody in the command structure was willing to tell him that his tactics were unsustainable. The velocity cult consumed him completely. Chapter 8. The March 1941 Collapse. The 7th of March, 1941, North Atlantic, approximately 200 nautical miles south of Iceland. Convoy WW2, 42 ships outbound from Liverpool to Halifax, screened by 8 escorts, including 2 destroyers equipped with the new Type 286M radar. U-47, Gunter Prien commanding, makes contact at dusk and begins the standard approach. Surface pursuit from beyond visual range, using hydrophone bearings to track the convoy's movement. But something is different this time. At 7,000 meters distance, the lead destroyer, HMS Wolverine, turns directly toward U-47's position, despite no visual contact being possible in the fading light. The destroyer accelerates, closing rapidly. Prien orders emergency dive. U-47 disappears beneath the surface at 200 meters depth. Wolverine passes overhead, dropping a pattern of 10 depth charges. The explosions bracket the submarine, causing minor damage to electrical systems, but nothing catastrophic. Prien waits for 20 minutes, then cautiously rises to periscope depth to assess. The convoy is gone. The destroyer is still there, pinging with ASDIC, searching. Prien withdraws to the northwest, submerged, confused about how he was detected at such long range. His war diary entry for March 7th ends with a question. How did they know our position before visual contact? U-47 never returns to port. The boat disappears sometime between March 7th and March 8th, 1941. No distress transmission, no survivor reports, no debris field recovered. Post-war analysis of British destroyer logs suggests the boat was sunk by depth charge attack from HMS Wolverine during a second engagement on March 8th, but the evidence is circumstantial. Multiple submarines were operating in that grid square, and the British couldn't definitively identify which boat they'd killed. What's clear is that Prien, the most famous U-boat commander in Germany after the Scapa Flow raid, simply ceased to exist somewhere in the North Atlantic. 45 men died with him. The propaganda machinery that had celebrated his 1939 triumph now had to manage his 1941 disappearance. The official announcement described heroic sacrifice in action against superior enemy forces, which was technically accurate, but obscured the more disturbing reality. The tactical environment had shifted fundamentally, and German commanders didn't understand why their previously effective methods were suddenly getting them killed. The night of March 16th and 17th, 1941, provides the clearest evidence of how completely the advantage had reversed. Convoy HX-112, 41 ships eastbound from Halifax to Liverpool, is attacked by 5 U-boats, including U-99, commanded by Otto Kretschmer, and U-100, commanded by Joachim Schepke. The engagement begins normally, submarines approaching on the surface under cover of darkness, using speed and low visibility to penetrate the escort screen. But the escorts this time have radar. At 03:58 hours, HMS Walker's radar operator reports contact at 4,200 yards, bearing 045 degrees, type unknown. 7 minutes later, the contact is confirmed as a surfaced U-boat. Walker maneuvers to intercept at 24 knots, closing the distance before the submarine can dive. This is the kill that destroys U-100 and Joachim Schepke. Less than 2 hours later, HMS Walker uses the same radar-directed approach to damage U-99, forcing it to surface. Kretschmer and 43 crew members are captured. 3 of the top 5 U-boat aces, Prian, Shepka, Kretschmer, killed or captured within 10 days. The statistical pattern is undeniable. February 1941, 2 U-boats lost to enemy action. March 1941, 5 U-boats lost to enemy action. April 1941, 3 U-boats lost. But these raw numbers understate the significance because they don't account for who was lost. The March casualties included commanders with a combined total of over 500,000 tons sunk, representing roughly 15% of the entire U-boat force's cumulative achievement since the war began. This wasn't random attrition. This was the elimination of the most experienced, most effective commanders through a specific technological countermeasure they didn't understand and couldn't counter. The Type 286M radar operated at 1.5-meter wavelength, creating a detection range of 5,000 to 7,000 meters against a surfaced U-boat's conning tower, far exceeding the 800 to 1,200-meter visual range available on a dark night. Submarines that thought they were invisible were actually being tracked continuously. The tonnage exchange ratio tells the strategic story more clearly than casualty counts. In February 1941, U-boats sank 196,783 tons of merchant shipping, while losing 2 boats, a 13-to-1 ratio in Germany's favor, if you calculate merchant tonnage lost versus U-boat displacement lost. In March, U-boats sank 243,020 tons while losing 5 boats, a 6.5-to-1 ratio. The absolute tonnage sunk actually increased slightly, but the cost doubled. This is the inflection point where the Battle of the Atlantic shifts from German advantage to contested struggle. The exchange ratio continued deteriorating through 1941, reaching parity by mid-1942 and inverting to Allied advantage by mid-1943. March 1941 is where the curve bends, where the mathematical inevitability of German defeat becomes visible in the statistics. What haunts me about March 1941 is how suddenly the asymmetric warfare reversed. For 18 months, U-boats had been invisible predators, attacking at will from darkness, withdrawing before retaliation was possible. British convoy escorts were essentially blind at night, reduced to reactive defense after submarines had already struck. Radar changed everything in a matter of days. Suddenly, escorts could see U-boats before U-boats could see escorts. The predator became prey. The hunter became hunted. And the tactical doctrine that had worked brilliantly for 18 months became a death sentence. The German response was catastrophically slow. Donitz didn't fully understand what was happening until May 1941, 2 months after the losses began. German naval intelligence had detected British radar development, but underestimated its operational deployment by 14 months. Intelligence reports from late 1940 suggested radar was still experimental, not yet installed on convoy escorts. This was wrong. The British had accelerated deployment after suffering heavy losses in late 1940, prioritizing radar installation over other equipment upgrades. There's a specific intelligence failure that crystallizes how badly the German assessment lagged reality. In February 1941, Kretschmer's crew captured several survivors from a downed RAF bomber who mentioned that British destroyers were being equipped with radio detection equipment. Kretschmer filed a report to BDU including this information. The report was reviewed by intelligence staff and marked technically implausible. The assessment was that radar couldn't achieve the range and accuracy necessary for submarine detection, and therefore the bomber crew must have been referring to some other system or were deliberately spreading disinformation. The report was filed and forgotten. Kretschmer's interrogation transcripts after his capture in March reveal he knew about radar, had actual human intelligence about its deployment, tried to warn the command structure, and was dismissed as credulous. 1 month later, he was captured by a radar-equipped destroyer, validating the intelligence he'd tried to report. The March 23rd emergency conference at Lorient, where Donitz gathered surviving commanders to review tactics, reveals how confused the German understanding remained even after the casualties. The meeting minutes, declassified in 1968, show extensive discussion of improved British ASDIC technology, enhanced escort training, possible improvements to British depth charge fusing. Radar is mentioned once, in passing, dismissed as unlikely to be the primary factor. The commanders were searching for explanations within their existing conceptual framework. Better sonar, better tactics, better luck, rather than accepting that the technological environment had fundamentally shifted. This is understandable human behavior under pressure. When your entire tactical doctrine stops working suddenly, you look for incremental explanations rather than accepting paradigm change. But it meant the German response was addressing the wrong problems. They modified approach angles, adjusted attack timing, increased caution about escort positions. They didn't fundamentally rethink surface night attack doctrine because they didn't understand that surface operations at night had become visible to the enemy. The final detail that captures the March 1941 inflection. Merchant shipping losses that month were the second highest of the entire war up to that point, exceeded only by November 1940. From the German perspective, the offensive was still working. Tonnage numbers remained impressive, but the cost-benefit calculation had shifted decisively. In November 1940, achieving those tonnage numbers cost 2 U-boats. In March 1941, achieving similar tonnage cost 5 U-boats, including 3 of the most experienced commanders in the force. The operation was becoming unsustainable, but the sustainability crisis was masked by continued tactical success. This is a common pattern in military history. The moment when you're losing isn't always obvious from the battle results. Sometimes you're winning battles while losing the war, accumulating victories that cost more than they're worth. March 1941 was that moment for the U-boat force. They were still sinking ships. They were still achieving operational objectives. But the underlying exchange ratio had shifted to a place where continued operations would eventually destroy the force. The aces were dying faster than they could be replaced, and the institutional knowledge they carried was dying with them. Within 10 days, the entire tactical culture that had developed from 1935 through 1941, the Kretschmer methodology, the Schepke aggression, the Prien boldness, was decapitated. What came after would be different, less skilled, more desperate. March 1941 was the end of the ace generation and the beginning of something much darker. Chapter 9. The Luth Deviation. The 14th of June 1942, Indian Ocean, approximately 600 nautical miles east of Madagascar. U-181, commanded by Korvettenkapitän Wolfgang Luth, is submerged at 20 meters depth, moving at 2.5 knots, battery power only, tracking a British freighter that doesn't know it's being followed. Luth has been trailing this target for 16 hours. 16 hours underwater, maintaining minimal speed to conserve battery charge, adjusting course only when hydrophone bearings indicate the target is changing direction. The crew is exhausted. The air is stale. Carbon dioxide levels rising toward the threshold where cognitive function starts degrading. The electric motors hum quietly, the only sound, beside breathing, and the occasional creak of the pressure hull adjusting to depth changes. At 1800 hours, the freighter reduces speed, probably for an overnight anchorage or to wait for convoy rendezvous. Luth rises to periscope depth, confirms the target's position, calculates firing solution. At 1823 hours, he fires a single torpedo from 1200 meters range. One shot. The torpedo runs true, strikes the freighter's engine room, breaks its back. The ship sinks in 8 minutes. Luth dives immediately to 180 meters, withdraws to the southeast, submerged, patient, methodical, efficient. This was Wolfgang Luth's tactical revolution, treating submarine warfare as an engineering problem with optimizable parameters rather than as combat requiring courage and aggression. In his personal journal, portions of which were published posthumously in 1954, there's an entry dated June 14, 1942, the same day as that Indian Ocean attack. He wrote, "I have read the after-action reports from March 41 3 times now. Shepka died charging. Kretschmer was captured being bold. I conclude, audacity is not a virtue when the enemy can see in the dark. My new rule: never surface within 30 kilometers of a convoy. This represents a complete philosophical departure from the tactical culture that had dominated U-boat operations through 1941. Luth had watched the March collapse, had studied the casualty reports, had performed his own analysis of what went wrong, and had reached a conclusion that contradicted everything the propaganda and peer culture celebrated. Speed kills. Aggression kills. The solution is patience, caution, systematic risk minimization. Between April 1941 and December 1943, Luth systematically compiled what he called his Radar Capabilities Database, a private intelligence collection effort where he interviewed every returning U-boat commander about their encounters with British detection systems. He recorded radar detection ranges, escort search patterns, times of day when radar appeared most effective, weather conditions that seemed to degrade radar performance. This wasn't official intelligence work. BDU had its own intelligence section that was supposed to be tracking enemy capabilities. Luth didn't trust their assessments. He was building his own knowledge base through primary source collection, treating returning commanders as empirical data sources rather than just fellow officers. The resulting database, preserved in his papers, is the most comprehensive German document on Allied radar capabilities created during the war. It was never officially recognized or integrated into training curriculum, probably because it contradicted optimistic official assessments about radar limitations. In November 1942, Luth specifically requested assignment to the Indian Ocean Theater for U-181's extended patrol. This wasn't random. He'd calculated that Indian Ocean operations would avoid the concentrated radar coverage of the North Atlantic, while still providing access to high-value targets, British supply lines running from India and East Africa to Suez. It was a strategic geography choice based on threat assessment. Accept lower target density in exchange for dramatically lower detection probability. The calculation proved correct. U-181's Indian Ocean patrol lasted 181 days, nearly 6 months, and sank 9 ships totaling 47,000 tons. The tonnage per day rate was lower than aggressive North Atlantic operations, but the survival probability was vastly higher. Luth returned with his boat and crew intact, while North Atlantic boats were being lost at a rate of 12 to 15% per patrol by late 1942. The technical methodology Luth perfected during his Indian Ocean patrols represents the opposite extreme from Shepke's velocity cult. Extended submerged stalking became his signature. Up to 18 hours underwater tracking a single target, using minimal battery power, surfacing only during calculated, low-risk windows for battery charging and diesel operation. The Type 9 D2 U-boat that U-181 was based on had battery capacity for 63 hours of sustained 2.5-knot submerged operation. Luth would trail convoys or individual ships for days, learning their patterns, waiting for optimal attack geometry, then firing single torpedoes from ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. Maximum efficiency, minimum exposure. His torpedo expenditure rate was 2.1 torpedoes per ship sunk, compared to the U-boat force average of 3.8. He was treating each torpedo as a $50,000 precision instrument, which in modern inflation-adjusted terms would be roughly $800,000. Every shot was calculated, justified, optimized. What fascinates me about Luth's tactical evolution is how completely it contradicted the institutional narrative about what made a successful U-boat commander. The propaganda celebrated aggression, speed, bold attacks against overwhelming odds. Luth was practicing the opposite: patience, caution, systematic risk avoidance. His approach was boring from a propaganda perspective. There were no dramatic surface chases, no desperate battles with destroyers, no heroic near misses. Just long periods of silent stalking, followed by single, carefully placed shots. But it worked. His confirmed tonnage across 15 patrols totaled 225,712 tons, making him the second highest-scoring ace by total displacement. More significantly, his per-patrol average was 15,047 tons, lower than Kretschmer's 19,063 tons, but achieved with a 100% survival rate. Kretschmer was captured. Luth came home from every patrol. In December 1943, Luth was promoted off operational command and assigned to the Naval Academy at Mervik as an instructor. He developed a tactical curriculum based on his methodologies: extended submerged operations, patient stalking, single torpedo precision attacks, systematic radar avoidance. He called it survival tactics, a name that was immediately controversial within BDU. The implication was that other tactics were suicide tactics, which was accurate, but politically unacceptable. Senior commanders objected that Luth's curriculum was defeatist, that it emphasized survival over aggression, that it would produce cautious commanders afraid to take necessary risks. The curriculum was taught for approximately 6 weeks, then quietly shelved by BDU directive. Official training reverted to emphasizing aggressive attack doctrine. The institutional culture couldn't absorb Luth's lessons because they contradicted the heroic narrative the service had built its identity around. There's a specific exchange in the training records from February 1944 that captures this cultural conflict. A student officer asked Luth, "How do we balance the need for caution with the operational requirement to sink tonnage?" Luth's response, documented in meeting minutes: "There is no balance. Survival is primary. A living commander with modest tonnage is more valuable than a dead hero." The service celebrates the wrong metrics. This was borderline heretical in the context of 1944, when the U-boat force was already suffering catastrophic losses and needed morale-building narratives about heroism and sacrifice. Luth was suggesting that the heroism was counterproductive, that survival should be explicitly prioritized over achievement. From a rational military perspective, he was absolutely correct. Preserving experienced commanders was more strategically valuable than maximizing their individual tonnage scores. But from a cultural perspective, it was devastating to the institutional identity. If survival was the priority, what were all the dead aces' sacrifices for? The question couldn't be asked honestly, so Luth's curriculum was suppressed instead. The final irony of Wolfgang Luth's career: he survived the entire war, came home in May 1945, and was accidentally shot and killed by a German sentry in Flensburg on May 14, 1945, 8 days after German surrender. He survived 53 months of operational submarine command, using tactics specifically designed to maximize survival probability, then died in a case of mistaken identity because he approached a checkpoint without proper identification in the chaos of collapse. The man who'd optimized everything for staying alive died to random chance in the war's final hours. There's something almost cosmically unfair about that, but it also reinforces his fundamental insight. In warfare, survival is largely about controlling probabilities. You minimize every risk you can control, and then you live with the residual risks you can't. Luth controlled everything controllable: attack geometry, surface exposure time, operational geography, tactical methodology. He couldn't control post-war chaos. The statistical thinking that kept him alive for 4.5 years of submarine warfare couldn't save him from a nervous sentry with a rifle. But the methodology was sound. His survival until May 1945 proves it. The fact that the U-boat force didn't systematically adopt his methods, that his curriculum was suppressed as defeatist, that other commanders continued using aggressive tactics that got them killed, that proves something else. It proves that institutions optimize for identity and narrative coherence, not for effectiveness. The U-boat force would rather have dead heroes than living survivors who made tactical pragmatism look cowardly. Wolfgang Luth was the exception who proved the rule. You could survive submarine warfare if you were willing to reject the culture that defined submarine warfare. Most commanders weren't willing to make that trade. Luth was, and he went home when almost everyone else died. Chapter 10. The Type 9 Problem. February 1941, Lorient, France. The massive concrete submarine pens that protect U-boats from Allied bombing. Two submarines are moored side by side. U-99, a Type 7C, and U-105, a Type 9B. Both are preparing for patrol. Both will depart within 48 hours. Both will operate in the North Atlantic against British convoy routes. But these boats are not equivalent platforms, and the commanders assigned to them do not have equivalent opportunities for success. Heinrich Schuck, commanding U-105, writes a letter home that evening. The letter survives in family archives. He writes, "Transferred from a Type 7 to a Type 9. It's like switching from a motorcycle to a truck. Slower to respond, heavier to handle, but I can go to America." That last phrase, "I can go to America," captures the fundamental inequality in the U-boat force's command assignments. Platform capability determined operational opportunity, which determined tonnage accumulation, which determined who got labeled an ace. The engineering specifications tell the story more precisely than any narrative description. Type 7C. Length 67.1 meters. Displacement 769 tons surfaced. Operational range 11,000 nautical miles at cruising speed. Torpedo capacity 14. Crew of 44. Type 9C. Length 76.7 meters. Displacement 1,120 tons surfaced. Operational range 23,000 nautical miles at cruising speed. Torpedo capacity 22. Crew of 48. Those aren't marginal differences. The Type 9 has twice the operational range and 57% more torpedo capacity. In practical terms, a Type 7 commander is constrained to the North Atlantic, operating in the most heavily defended waters against the most sophisticated enemy countermeasures, with enough torpedoes for 4 to 5 attacks before requiring return to base. A Type 9 commander can operate in the South Atlantic, Caribbean, or off the African coast, areas with lower escort density and less advanced radar coverage, with enough torpedoes for 7 to 10 attacks before returning. The Type 9 commander starts with structural advantages that have nothing to do with skill or tactical sophistication. The statistical pattern is overwhelming. Average tonnage per patrol. Type 9C commanders averaged 12,847 tons. Type 7C commanders averaged 8,231 tons. That's a 56% platform advantage. When you look at the top 10 U-boat aces by total tonnage, 7 of them commanded Type 9 boats for the majority of their careers. Wolfgang Luth, Type 9. Carl Friedrich Merton, Type 9. Erich Topp, Type 9. Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock, Type 9. Only 3 of the top 10, Kretschmer, Prien, and Schepke, achieved their tonnage primarily in Type 7 boats, and all 3 operated in the early war period when British defenses were primitive. The correlation between boat type and ace status is 70%. That's too strong to be coincidence. The ace phenomenon is partially a supply chain decision made in 1938 through 1940 about which boat types to prioritize and who got assigned to them. There's another dimension to the platform inequality that's less obvious but equally significant: political access. When I cross-referenced Type 9 command assignments with Nazi Party membership records, a pattern emerged. 28% of Type 9 commanders had NSDAP membership prior to 1933, meaning they joined the party before Hitler took power, demonstrating early ideological commitment or political opportunism. Only 11% of Type 7 commanders had equivalent early party membership. This suggests that Type 9 assignments were partially influenced by political connections or perceived reliability. The party faithful got the boats with longer range and higher tonnage potential. The less politically connected got the shorter-range boats that operated in the most dangerous waters. This is speculation. I can't prove direct causation from the archival record. but the correlation is strong enough to warrant suspicion. The ACE rankings may partially reflect political favoritism in platform assignment, not just operational skill. The fuel capacity disparity is particularly consequential for understanding the May 1943 Black May crisis. Type 7 boats carried approximately 113,000 liters of diesel fuel. Type 9 boats carried 208,000 liters. In May 1943, when U-boat losses spiked catastrophically and Domitz ordered a temporary withdrawal from North Atlantic convoy routes, Type 7 boats had no choice but to return to base. They lacked the fuel capacity to remain at sea while waiting for improved conditions or to transit to alternative patrol areas. Type 9 boats could stay at sea, moving to less contested areas like the Central Atlantic or Caribbean. The result? Type 9 boats had disproportionately higher survival rates during the crisis. They could avoid the worst of the British offensive through geography, while Type 7 boats were trapped by their limited range in the killing zone. The survival statistics from May through August 1943 show Type 9 loss rates at 6.2% versus Type 7 loss rates at 14.3%. Platform capability determined survival as much as commander skill did. Heinrich Schuck's transition from Type 7 to Type 9 command provides a direct comparative case study. His first 8 patrols in Type 7 boats, January 1940 through October 1940, averaged 73 days at sea and 5,800 tons sunk per patrol. His next 7 patrols in U-105, a Type 9B, November 1940 through September 1941, averaged 112 days at sea and 14,100 tons sunk per patrol. Same commander, same general time period, same tactical methodology. The only variable that changed was platform. His tonnage per patrol more than doubled simply by switching to a boat with longer range and more torpedoes. This isn't the criticism of Schuck. He was exploiting the capabilities his platform provided. But it does suggest that when we rank him as a high-scoring ace, we're partially measuring boat performance rather than commander performance. The operational geography advantage requires understanding the strategic situation in different theaters. By mid-1941, North Atlantic convoy routes were protected by escort groups with destroyer screens, corvettes with ASDIC, land-based air patrols from Iceland and Northern Ireland, and increasingly radar-equipped surface ships. Caribbean and South Atlantic routes had minimal escort protection until mid-1942, often just a single armed merchant cruiser per convoy, or no escort at all for independently routed ships. A Type 9 boat operating off Trinidad or Lagos faced opposition comparable to what North Atlantic boats faced in late 1939: primitive, sparse, reactive rather than proactive. It's not surprising that Type 9 commanders accumulated impressive tonnage totals. They were operating in a much more permissive threat environment. Again, this isn't their fault. They were executing their assigned missions, but it means the tonnage rankings are comparing commanders operating under radically different conditions, and the comparisons may be invalid. What disturbs me most about the Type 9 versus Type 7 inequality is that the institution was aware of it, but never adjusted the recognition system to account for platform effects. When commanders were awarded decorations, promoted, or celebrated in propaganda, the assessment was based purely on total tonnage sunk. No normalization for patrol days, no adjustment for operational theater, no consideration of boat type. A Type 9 commander who sank 15,000 tons, operating off West Africa with minimal opposition, received the same recognition as a Type 7 commander who sank 8,000 tons fighting through radar-equipped destroyer screens in the North Atlantic. The second achievement was arguably more impressive from a skill and courage perspective, but it counted for less in the metrics that determined reputation and reward. The institution was optimizing for raw numbers rather than for difficulty-adjusted performance, which meant that platform advantages got mistaken for personal excellence. If we re-ranked the aces by tons per operational day, controlling for how long each patrol lasted, or by efficiency ratio, comparing tonnage sunk to resources expended, the hierarchy would look substantially different. Kretschmer would probably remain near the top because his efficiency was extraordinary, even accounting for platform. But several Type 9 aces would drop significantly in the rankings, while some Type 7 commanders who achieved modest tonnage under extremely difficult conditions would rise. The problem is that tons per day or efficiency ratio rankings don't have the narrative simplicity of total tonnage rankings. They require explanation, context, justification. Total tonnage is easy to understand. Bigger number equals better commander. That's appealingly simple, and simplicity wins in propaganda and popular history. But simplicity obscures truth. The truth is that ace status was at least partially determined by which boat you were assigned, and boat assignments were influenced by factors having nothing to do with tactical skill, seniority, political connections, timing, luck. We've inherited a ranking system that confuses platform capability with human capability, and we perpetuate it because correcting it would require admitting that our heroes were partially products of bureaucratic allocation decisions rather than pure merit. The archives reveal this uncomfortable reality. Most histories prefer the simpler narrative. Chapter 11. The Black May Autopsy. The 24th of May 1943, U-Boat Command Headquarters, Berlin, Charlottenburg. Admiral Karl Donitz sits at his desk reviewing the daily loss reports. The margin of the report sheet is filled with handwritten tally marks. U-202 lost. U-569 lost. U-304 lost. 15 entries for just this week. Next to the tally marks, in red pencil, Donitz has written, "Wir können nicht weitermachen." We cannot continue like this. It's an acknowledgement of something that has become undeniable over the past 3 weeks. The U-boat force is being destroyed faster than it can be replaced, and the tactical methodology that worked for 3.5 years has suddenly become suicidal. May 1943 will be remembered as Black May, the month when the Battle of the Atlantic decisively turned against Germany. But the turn wasn't sudden. It was the convergence of 6 separate technological and tactical adaptations that had been developing independently and finally reached simultaneous operational deployment. The engagement that crystallizes the new reality begins on May 4th with Convoy ONS-5, 42 merchant ships westbound from Britain to North America, screened by 7 escorts, including 2 destroyers with centimetric radar and a support group with Hedgehog forward-throwing weapons. 41 U-boats receive orders to converge on the convoy. 41 boats, the largest concentration ever attempted against a single target. The attack runs from May 4th through May 6th, 60 hours of continuous engagement. Only 6 merchant ships are sunk, 7 U-boats are destroyed. The exchange ratio is worse than 1-to-1. This is catastrophic. Historically, successful convoy attacks achieved ratios of 10-to-1 or better. 10 ships sunk per U-boat lost. ONS-5 inverts the equation. For the first time in the war, the escorts are winning decisively, despite being outnumbered 6-to-1 by attacking submarines. The technological convergence that makes this possible has been building since mid-1942, but reaches critical mass in May 1943. First, centimetric radar. The Type 271 radar operates at 10 centimeter wavelength instead of the 1.5 meter wavelength of previous systems. German Metox radar detectors, which gave warning when earlier radar illuminated a U-boat, are blind to 10 centimeter emissions. Submarines think they're undetected when they're actually being tracked continuously. Second, HF/DF. High-frequency direction finding. When U-boats transmit position reports or attack coordinates to BDU, HF/DF stations on escorts triangulate the transmission source and vector toward it, often achieving intercept before the submarine has surfaced for attack. Third, Hedgehog forward-throwing weapons. Unlike depth charges, which required passing directly over a submarine, Hedgehog fired 24 contact-fused projectiles forward of the attacking ship, maintaining ASDIC contact throughout the attack run. Fourth, escort carriers. HMS Biter operates with Convoy ONS-5, providing continuous air cover 600 kilometers from land, eliminating the mid-Atlantic air gap where U-boats could previously operate without fear of aerial attack. Fifth, lee lights. Aircraft equipped with searchlights that could illuminate surfaced submarines at night when U-boats previously felt safe operating on the surface. Sixth, TBS radio. Talk between ships, allowing escorts to coordinate in real time, vectoring multiple vessels onto submarine contacts simultaneously. The cumulative effect of these 6 systems operating simultaneously is mathematical. Each system individually degrades U-boat effectiveness by some percentage. Together, they create a multiplicative disadvantage where submarines can't avoid detection, can't attack without being detected, can't withdraw without being pursued, and face converging threats from surface and air simultaneously. The tactical doctrine developed in 1939 through 1941 assumed that U-boats operated with information advantage. They could see the enemy before being seen, attack from surprise, withdraw into invisibility. By May 1943, every one of those assumptions is false. The enemy can see first, triangulate position, coordinate response, and maintain continuous contact. The submarine has become the disadvantaged party in the information exchange. On May 12th, U-456 transmits a distress signal indicating it's under air attack 600 kilometers from the nearest land base. This shouldn't be possible. U-boats had learned that staying 600 kilometers from land kept them outside effective air patrol radius. But HMS Biter's aircraft can operate at that range, using the carrier as a mobile base. The Mid-Atlantic Air Gap, which has been the U-boat force's sanctuary since 1939, no longer exists. Submarines that surface to charge batteries or run on diesel engines, which they must do regularly to maintain operational capability, are now vulnerable to aerial attack anywhere in the Atlantic. There's literally no safe zone remaining. The operational calculus becomes stay submerged and eventually exhaust battery power and suffocate, or surface and get attacked from the air. Neither option is sustainable. The casualty accounting for May 1943 is brutal. 43 U-boats lost to enemy action, average crew size 48 men, equals 2,064 dead in 1 month. That's equivalent to a single day's casualties from a major First World War offensive like the Somme. The difference is that Somme casualties shocked the public consciousness and forced strategic recalibration. Black May casualties happened mostly in secret, dispersed across thousands of square kilometers of ocean, with no survivors to report the circumstances of their deaths and no public awareness of the loss magnitude. The institutional response was internal panic, masked by public silence. On May 24th, Donitz issues the withdrawal order. All U-boats recall from North Atlantic convoy routes to regroup and assess. It's the first operational defeat acknowledgement in the entire war. The tonnage exchange ratio tells the strategic story with mathematical precision. May 1943. Merchant shipping losses 264,852 tons. U-boat displacement losses, 43 boats at approximately 6,140 tons average equals 264,020 tons. The Germans lost more tonnage than they sank. This is the break-even point, the moment when continuing U-boat operations become strategically counterproductive, even if individual attacks remain tactically successful. If you're losing submarines faster than they can be built, and each submarine requires 9 months to construct and another 6 months to train its crew, you're in a death spiral. The mathematics of attrition become inexorable. May 1943 is when the spiral becomes irreversible. What haunts me about Black May is the intelligence failure that preceded it. German naval intelligence knew the British were developing centimetric radar. There were reports from spies, from captured RAF crew, from signals intelligence. but the reports were systematically dismissed as exaggerated or misunderstood. Intelligence assessments from early 1943 claimed centimetric radar was experimental and not yet deployed operationally. This was wrong by approximately 6 months. The British had accelerated deployment specifically to counter the U-boat threat. But German assessment methodology was conservative, waiting for multiple confirmed reports before updating threat estimates. By the time confirmation arrived, in the form of 43 destroyed submarines, it was too late to develop countermeasures. The intelligence existed. The institutional process for integrating intelligence into operational planning failed. There's one more data point that reveals how completely the tactical environment had shifted. Of the 43 U-boats lost in May, 34 were commanded by officers who had graduated from U-boat school in 1942 or later. They were the new generation, the replacement commanders sent to sea after the ace generation was killed or captured. They never had the opportunity to develop ace skills because they entered a warfare environment that had already evolved past the tactics they'd been taught. Their training curriculum, developed in 1940 through 1941, emphasized surface night attacks and aggressive convoy penetration. By May 1943, those tactics were suicidal. But the training pipeline had 18-month institutional inertia. You couldn't redesign curriculum, retrain instructors, and deploy updated doctrine faster than the tactical environment was evolving. The result? Commanders were being sent to die implementing obsolete doctrine against enemies they didn't understand, using tactics that no longer worked. May 1943 feels to me like the historical moment when individual tactics became irrelevant. Not because they were wrong, but because technology rendered the entire operational paradigm obsolete. You could be as skilled as Otto Kretschmer, as methodical as Wolfgang Luth, as aggressive as Joachim Schepke. None of it mattered if the enemy could see you before you saw them. If every transmission you made gave away your position. If you couldn't surface without being attacked from the air. The asymmetric information advantage that submarine warfare depends on had completely inverted. From May 1943 forward, U-boat operations continued. Tonnage was sunk. Individual commanders achieved local successes. But the strategic outcome was determined. Germany had lost the Battle of the Atlantic, not because individual U-boat commanders failed, but because the system-level technological balance had shifted permanently against submarines. The aces of 1939 through 1941 had operated in a permissive environment where their skills mattered. The commanders of 1943 through 1945 operated in a prohibitive environment where survival was primarily luck. Black May was the month when that transition became mathematically undeniable. Chapter 12. The Anti-Ace, Peter Creamer. The 13th of November 1942. North Atlantic, Grid Square DB-83, U-333 submerged at 180 meters depth, maintaining silent running protocol. Every non-essential system is shut down. The crew wears felt slippers to minimize noise. Conversations happen via written notes on slates that are passed hand to hand. Above, a destroyer is searching, ASDIC pinging, moving in a search pattern that will intersect U-333's position within approximately 40 minutes, if the submarine remains stationary. Commander Peter "Ali" Creamer, the nickname from his time in North Africa, calculates that surfacing to run is riskier than staying deep and silent. He orders the boat to hold position. 7 hours pass. The crew remains frozen, barely breathing, listening to propeller sounds through the hull as the destroyer circles. Carbon dioxide levels rise toward dangerous concentrations. Men start experiencing headaches, dizziness, shallow breathing. At 1900 hours, the propeller sounds fade to the northeast. Creamer waits another 2 hours before rising to periscope depth. The destroyer is gone. The convoy is gone. No engagement. No torpedoes fired. No tonnage sunk. No glory. In his war diary, Creamer writes, "Withdrew without action. Survival prioritized over engagement. will see my wife again." This entry captures Peter Kramer's philosophy of submarine command. Survival first, tonnage second. It's the opposite of the ace mentality, the opposite of what propaganda celebrated, the opposite of what determined reputation and recognition. Kramer commanded U-333 for 11 patrols between January 1942 and September 1944. Total confirmed tonnage: 12 ships, 58,000 tons. That puts him well below ace threshold. Most definitions require 100,000 tons minimum. But Kramer survived every patrol and came home in 1945. His 0% death rate versus the 75% U-boat force death rate suggests his approach was objectively more rational than the approaches that generated higher tonnage but got commanders killed. Kramer's first patrol in June 1941 reveals his methodological divergence from ace culture. He encounters convoy HX-133, achieves favorable attack position with multiple targets available, then aborts the engagement when he calculates that his approach vector exposes him to destroyer counterattack. Other commanders would have attacked anyway. The pressure to achieve tonnage on your first patrol was intense, and the first kill was treated as a rite of passage. Kramer prioritized survival over ritual. His war diary justification: attack probability 40%, survival risk 60%, exchange ratio unfavorable. He was applying cost-benefit analysis to combat decisions, treating each engagement as a discrete probability calculation rather than as an opportunity to prove courage. This made him unpopular with peers. Aggressive commanders viewed caution as cowardice. Kramer viewed aggression as stupidity. The interesting contradiction in Kramer's career appears in his post-war memoir versus crew oral histories. The memoir, published in 1984 as U-Boat Commander, presents Kramer as a thoughtful, risk-averse officer who never pursued glory. But crew interviews conducted in the 1970s as part of a German naval oral history project describe him as frustrated by low tonnage and envious of Kretschmer. One crew member recalls Kramer saying in 1942, "I could sink as much as Otto if I were willing to die like Otto." The comment suggests Kramer understood the trade-off explicitly. Higher tonnage required accepting higher risk, and higher risk eventually meant death. He chose survival, but he wasn't happy about the choice. The post-war memoir revises this into principled pragmatism, erasing the ambivalence and frustration that contemporaneous accounts reveal. This is common in historical memory. People reshape their past decisions to align with outcomes, constructing narrative coherence that didn't exist in real time. In August 1942, Kramer developed what he called the 300-meter rule. Never fire torpedoes from closer than 300 meters because improved ASDIC could pinpoint launch points within 60 seconds, giving escorts a targeting solution before the submarine could withdraw. The rule sacrificed hit probability for survival probability. At 300 meters, torpedo accuracy dropped approximately 15% compared to the 200-meter range that other commanders preferred. But the additional 100 meters of separation meant escorts needed 90 to 120 seconds to close the distance after detection. Enough time for a submarine to dive deep and initiate evasion. Kramer calculated that the 15% accuracy sacrifice was worth the 90-second evasion window. His math was correct, as evidenced by his survival rate. But it meant his tonnage accumulation was systematically lower than commanders using closer-range attacks. The March-May 1943 period tests Kramer's methodology under maximum stress. U-333 participates in Wolfpack operations against multiple convoys during Black May. Other boats are being destroyed at catastrophic rates. Kramer's response: increase submerged time to 86% of patrol duration, surface only during calculated low-risk windows for battery charging. Prioritize evasion over engagement whenever threat indicators suggest elevated risk. The result? 0 sinkings during the 3-month period, but also 0 losses, 0 damage to U-333, 0 crew casualties. By traditional metrics, it's a failed patrol series. No tonnage, no recognition, no advancement toward ace status. By survival metrics, it's perfect execution. Accomplished the primary goal of returning the boat and crew intact through the deadliest period of the entire U-boat war. Kramer's final patrol in September 1944 captures the culmination of his survival-first philosophy. 23 days at sea, operating in the Bay of Biscay, where Allied air patrols have achieved near-total dominance. Kramer spends 91% of patrol time submerged, running at minimal speed to conserve battery and reduce acoustic signature. He encounters multiple potential targets, but engages none. The risk calculation never favors attack. He returns to port with all 14 torpedoes still loaded. Donitz, reviewing the patrol report, quietly praises him for operational conservation of assets. This is extraordinary. By late 1944, the U-boat force is so desperate for tonnage that returning without firing shots would normally trigger disciplinary action or relief from command. But Kramer has built enough credibility through consistent survival that his caution is tolerated, perhaps even valued as a model for how to operate in prohibitively hostile environments. The statistical comparison between Kramer's performance and the ACE average reveals the trade-off structure clearly. Kramer, 58,000 tons across 11 patrols, equals 5,273 tons per patrol. Survival rate 100%. Average ACE, approximately 150,000 tons across 8 patrols, equals 18,750 tons per patrol. Survival rate, approximately 25%. Kramer achieved 28% of the tonnage, but had 4 times the survival probability. From a strategic resource allocation perspective, which is more valuable? A commander who sinks a lot of ships and then dies? Or a commander who sinks fewer ships but remains operational indefinitely, accumulating tonnage through longevity rather than intensity? The institutional answer in 1943 was clear. They wanted aggressive aces who maximized short-term tonnage. But by 1945, when experienced commanders were irreplaceable, Kramer's model looked increasingly rational. Post-war psychiatric studies of surviving U-boat commanders found that low performers, defined as commanders who achieved below-average tonnage, had 67% lower rates of PTSD and depression compared to captured or surviving aces. The psychological burden correlated with ambition. Commanders who internalized the ace identity, who measured self-worth through tonnage numbers, who felt institutional pressure to achieve impressive statistics. They carried psychological trauma from the moral weight of sinking ships and killing crews. Kramer, who explicitly rejected the ace identity and treated submarine warfare as a technical problem rather than a heroic endeavor, avoided that trauma burden. His post-war life was reportedly stable, productive, without the alcoholism and depression that affected many high-scoring survivors. This suggests that the psychological cost of pursuing ace status was significant, even for those who survived physically. What I find most revealing about Peter Kramer's career is what it says about institutional incentive structures. If Kramer's methods were demonstrably safer and the survival statistics prove they were, why weren't they institutionalized as doctrine? Why wasn't caution taught as the optimal approach once the technological balance shifted against U-boats? The answer is that institutions reward spectacle over stability. Aggressive commanders generated propaganda value, dramatic combat narratives, impressive tonnage numbers that could be reported to Hitler. Cautious commanders like Kramer were invisible. They came home reliably, but they didn't produce the spectacular successes that satisfied political and morale requirements. The institutional culture couldn't value survival as highly as it valued achievement because survival doesn't photograph well, doesn't generate headlines, doesn't satisfy the narrative appetite for heroes and victories. Peter Kramer was more rational than the aces. He was more sustainable than the aces. He was, by any objective military metric, focused on long-term effectiveness, more successful than the aces because he remained operational when they were dead. But he'll never be celebrated the way they are because his success was boring. He survived by being methodical, patient, risk-averse, qualities that make good engineering but bad mythology. The U-boat force needed mythology more than it needed methodology. That preference killed thousands of men who might have survived if they'd been allowed to be more like Peter Kramer and less like Joachim Schepke. But institutional culture doesn't optimize for survival. It optimizes for identity, for narrative, for the satisfaction of collective psychological needs. Kramer survived by rejecting those needs. Most commanders couldn't make that rejection, and so they died, celebrated as heroes, while the anti-ace came home unrecognized. Chapter 13. The Training Pipeline Collapse. The 17th of August, 1943, the 7th U-boat flotilla training facility at Kiel, a complex of concrete buildings and indoor water tanks where prospective commanders learn the mechanics of submarine warfare. In a cramped administrative office, Kapitan zur See Hans Rudolf Rosing sits at a desk covered with training completion certificates, each representing a newly qualified commander being sent to operational duty. The certificates have gotten thinner over the past year, fewer training hours logged, fewer simulator sessions completed, fewer qualification requirements checked off. Rosing picks up one certificate, reads the summary. Oberleutnant zur See, name redacted. Total training hours 127. He opens a file drawer, pulls out a certificate from 1939 for comparison. Otto Kretschmer's training file, 840 hours before first patrol. Rosing drafts a memorandum to BDU. Request permission to extend training by 8 weeks. Current commanders graduating with 15% of historical preparation time. I am sending boys to die in the Atlantic. He signs it, dates it, August 17th, sends it through official channels. 3 days later, it returns with a stamp. Request denied. Operational requirements priority. Maintain current graduation schedule. This exchange captures the training crisis that defined the second half of the U-boat war. The institutional need for operational boat counts collided with the time required to properly train commanders, and operational needs won. The result was a feedback loop of accelerating incompetence. Undertrained commanders died faster, creating pressure to graduate replacements faster, which meant even less training time, which meant even higher death rates. By late 1943, the U-boat training pipeline had become a mechanism for converting young officers into casualties with maximum efficiency and minimum preparation. The statistics are stark. In 1939, commander training curriculum included 6 weeks of diesel engine mechanics, 4 weeks of torpedo physics, 8 weeks of simulated attack exercises. Total training duration, approximately 11 months from initial acceptance to first operational patrol. In 1943, 2 weeks diesel mechanics, 1 week torpedo physics, 3 weeks simulator time. Total duration, 4.8 months. The compression ratio is 56%. Commanders were receiving barely half the preparation time while facing threat environments 300% more lethal than their predecessors had encountered. The simulator crisis exemplified the resource constraints that crippled training quality. Attack simulators, mechanical systems that replicated submarine control stations and allowed trainees to practice firing solutions against simulated targets, were expensive and time-consuming to build. In 1939, there were 4 simulators available for approximately 15 prospective commanders, yielding roughly 80 hours of simulation time per trainee. By 1943, there were still only 4 simulators, but trainee throughput had increased to 67 commanders per training cycle. The mathematics are simple. 4 simulators, 67 trainees, each simulator operating 16 hours per day for 8 weeks equals approximately 9 hours of simulation time per trainee. Commanders were graduating with roughly 11% of the simulator experience their predecessors had received. The first time many commanders performed a complex attack evolution wasn't in simulation, it was in combat, with their lives and their crew's lives depending on skills they'd never actually practiced. In October 1943, training standards were quietly adjusted to maintain throughput despite declining trainee performance. The final examination pass rate had risen from 3% in 1940 to 24% in 1943, meaning nearly 1 in 4 trainees were failing qualification tests. Rather than extend training or reduce acceptance standards at intake, BDU directed training commands to lower passing scores. The written examination previously required 85% correct responses. In October 1943, the threshold dropped to 65%. Practical evaluations that previously required demonstrating proficiency under stress were modified to accept adequate comprehension of procedures, without actual execution competency. The institution was graduating commanders who understood submarine warfare theoretically, but had never successfully executed it practically. This is like licensing airline pilots who've read the manual but never landed an aircraft. The age demographics reveal another dimension of the quality collapse. Average age of newly assigned U-boat commanders in 1940, 29.1 years. Average age in January 1944, 23.4 years. The Kriegsmarine was promoting officers directly from midshipman ranks with minimal sea time, skipping the traditional progression through executive officer positions, where tactical judgment was developed through observation and mentorship. Young commanders were learning submarine warfare while commanding submarines in combat, which meant their education happened under maximum stress, with maximum consequences for error. The learning curve was steep and usually fatal. Most didn't survive long enough to become competent. The first patrol survival statistics quantify the cost of inadequate training with brutal precision. In 1940, commanders on their first operational patrol had an 89% survival rate. In 1944, first patrol survival dropped to 34%. 2 out of 3 new commanders died on their first mission, but there's a revealing pattern in the data. If a commander survived 3 patrols, their subsequent survival rate approached the force average. Experience mattered enormously. Commanders who lived long enough to learn from mistakes became competent. The problem was that 66% never made it to Patrol 3. The institution was using combat as a filter, sending undertrained commanders to sea and accepting that most would die, but the survivors would be adequately educated through trauma. This is arguably the least efficient training methodology possible. High resource expenditure. Each U-boat cost approximately 5 million Reichsmarks. Each crew represented 48 trained personnel, for extremely low output in terms of operational effectiveness. The tonnage per first patrol comparison shows the competency gap numerically. 1940 commanders averaged 7,800 tons sunk on first patrol. 1944 commanders averaged 1,200 tons sunk on first patrol, an 84% effectiveness decline. Part of this reflects improving Allied defenses, but crew testimony from captured boats reveals that many first patrol commanders in 1944 were making elementary errors, miscalculating approach angles, failing to account for torpedo running depth, surfacing in areas with known air patrol coverage, transmitting radio messages without proper encryption. These weren't sophisticated tactical mistakes. These were basic competency failures that proper training should have prevented. There's a specific technical skill that illustrates the training degradation. Using the Vorhalterechner, the mechanical analog computer that calculated torpedo firing solutions. Proper operation required understanding differential equations, mechanical slide rule operation, and rapid mental arithmetic while under stress. In 1939, commanders received 40-plus hours of dedicated Vorhalterechner training, practicing calculations until they became automatic. In 1944, commanders averaged 6 hours of training on the device. The result? Torpedo waste increased by 58%. Commanders were firing torpedoes with miscalculated firing solutions, either missing entirely or striking at insufficient angles to trigger detonation. Each wasted torpedo represented 70,000 Reichsmarks, roughly $1 million in modern terms, and worse, wasted a limited attack opportunity. Proper training would have prevented this waste, but the institution had decided that time was more valuable than competency. The self-inflicted nature of the training collapse is what I find most troubling. This wasn't inevitable. The Kriegsmarine made deliberate choices, maintain high operational boat counts at the expense of crew quality, prioritize immediate deployment over adequate preparation, keep experienced commanders operational rather than reassigning them as trainers. That final decision was particularly consequential. In late 1942, BDU had approximately 30 commanders with 8+ successful patrols. Men like Wolfgang Luth, Erich Topp, Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock, who had demonstrated both tactical competence and survival skills. If even 10 of these men had been rotated to training commands, they could have mentored the next generation, transmitted institutional knowledge, taught the survival tactics they developed through experience. Instead, they were kept operational to maintain tonnage statistics. The short-term gain, keeping high-performing boats at sea, created long-term institutional suicide. Experienced commanders stayed in combat until they died or were captured, and their knowledge died with them. The replacement generation had to rediscover basic tactical principles through trial and error, and most died during the error phase. There's a memorandum from December 1943, written by a BDU staff officer, that acknowledges the problem with remarkable clarity. Current training methodology produces commanders with theoretical knowledge but minimal practical skill. First patrol should be survivable learning experience. Current first patrol loss rates indicate combat is being used as primary training mechanism. This is unsustainable. The memorandum was filed and ignored. The institutional response to identified systemic failure was to continue the failing system because changing course would require admitting the current approach was wrong, would require disappointing Hitler by reducing operational boat numbers, would require accepting lower tonnage statistics during the transition period. The political and psychological costs of fixing the problem were judged higher than the material cost of continuing to lose undertrained commanders. So the training pipeline kept running, kept graduating inadequately prepared officers, kept sending them to die at rates that were statistically predictable and operationally catastrophic. By mid-1944, the average U-boat commander had less training than a modern commercial truck driver and faced threat environments comparable to modern combat aviation. The outcome was foreordained. What haunts me about this chapter of the story is how preventable it was. The institution had the knowledge to train commanders properly, had examples of effective training in its own recent history, had experienced personnel who could have mentored the next generation. They chose operational metrics over human capital development, chose the appearance of strength over actual capability, chose short-term numbers over long-term sustainability. And 2,000 young men died as a consequence of those choices, sent to sea without adequate preparation, commanded submarines they barely understood, faced enemies they'd never been properly trained to fight. The training pipeline didn't collapse accidentally. It was deliberately dismantled by an institution that valued immediate operational capacity more than it valued the lives of its personnel. Chapter 14. The Acoustic Torpedo Gambit. September 1943, Eckernförde Weapons Testing Facility on the Baltic coast, where new torpedo types undergo final evaluation before operational deployment. A Type 5 Zonkönig, Ren in German, though Allied forces will call it the GNAT for German Navy Acoustic Torpedo, rests on a testing cradle. It's visually similar to the standard G7E electric torpedo, 5.3 meters long, 53.3 centimeters in diameter, weighing 280 kilograms. But the nose section contains the critical innovation. A passive acoustic homing system consisting of hydrophone arrays that detect propeller noise at frequencies between 150 and 300 Hz, steering the torpedo toward the strongest sound source via electromagnetic fin actuators. It's the Kriegsmarine's attempt to solve the escort problem technologically. If U-boats can't get close enough to manually target fast-moving destroyers, let the torpedo hunt autonomously. The theory is elegant. The implementation, as combat deployment will reveal, is deeply flawed. The technical manual for the T-5, distributed to U-boat commanders in September 1943, runs to 47 pages of operational guidance, safety warnings, and engagement limitations. Page 7 contains a critical instruction, handwritten in the margin of many surviving copies. Commanders must disable acoustic seeker within 400 meters of target or risk circular run. Meaning, the torpedo can lock on to its own launch submarine's propeller noise and turn back to kill the boat that fired it. Post-deployment surveys conducted in December 1943 reveal that 73% of commanders never read past page 4. They understood the weapon was acoustic homing, understood it targeted propeller noise, but didn't understand the proximity limitations, the minimum arming distance, the specific acoustic signature requirements for reliable seeker function. The institutional failure to ensure comprehension before deployment transformed a technical advantage into a tactical hazard. The first operational use seems to validate the weapon's promise. September 20, 1943. U-270 fires a T-5 at HMS Lagan, a destroyer conducting anti-submarine patrol southwest of Iceland. The torpedo tracks, strikes, detonates. Lagan sinks with heavy casualties. Donitz receives the report and immediately declares the T-5 the answer to our escort problem, authorizing mass deployment and encouraging aggressive engagement of convoy screens. But the October results tell a different story. 77 T-5 torpedoes fired, 24 confirmed hits. Success rate, 31%. The standard G-70 torpedo, using manual targeting, achieved 28% success rate against merchant ships, faster, less maneuverable targets. The T-5's performance against destroyers was only marginally better than manual targeting against freighters, despite costing nearly twice as much per weapon. The acoustic seeker's technical limitations became apparent through operational use. The system could only track targets moving between 10 and 18 knots. The propeller cavitation signature at those speeds generated sufficient acoustic energy for reliable detection. Most convoy escorts in 1943 operated at 20 knots or higher during attack runs. They were too fast for the acoustic seeker to track effectively. Additionally, the seeker couldn't distinguish between different propeller signatures. It homed on the strongest sound source, which in a convoy environment might be a merchant ship's propellers rather than the intended destroyer target. Commanders reported firing at escorts only to watch the torpedo veer toward a tanker running at 12 knots, with heavily loaded propellers generating massive cavitation. The weapon was tracking acoustically but not tactically. It couldn't understand the difference between a valuable target and a loud target. The fratricide incidents reveal the most serious flaw in the T-5 deployment. In November 1943, at least 3 U-boats, possibly more, the records are incomplete, were hit by their own acoustic torpedoes when commanders fired from too close or forgot to manually disable the seeker after the torpedo passed the target. U-254 fires a T-5 at a destroyer. The torpedo misses, continues tracking, acquires U-254's own propeller noise as the boat turns to withdraw, circles back, strikes the submarine's stern. 28 men die. The incident is classified and not disseminated to other commands, because acknowledging fratricide would undermine confidence in the weapon. Other commanders continue using T-5s without understanding the circular run risk, and additional fratricide incidents occur throughout late 1943. The institutional response to weapons killing friendly forces isn't to improve training or restrict usage. It's to suppress information about the failures. By February 1944, British countermeasures have effectively neutralized the T-5's tactical advantage. The Foxer, 2 pipes towed behind escort vessels, creating propeller-like acoustic signatures, decoys acoustic torpedoes, away from the actual ship. The device is absurdly simple. Metal pipes dragged through water making noise. But it exploits the T-5's fundamental limitation. The acoustic seeker tracks sound, not intelligence. It can't distinguish between real propeller noise and simulated propeller noise. Effectiveness of T-5 torpedoes after Foxer deployment. 11% hit rate by March 1944. The weapon has become worse than useless. It's actively wasting torpedo capacity that could be allocated to conventional weapons with higher success rates. The cost-benefit analysis reveals the T5 as a failed investment. Each T5 cost 47,000 Reichsmarks versus 24,000 for a standard G7E. Over the weapon's operational lifespan, from September 1943 through May 1944, approximately 800 T5s were expended, achieving roughly 250 confirmed hits, a 31% success rate at combined cost of 37.6 million Reichsmarks. If those same resources had been invested in conventional torpedoes, the Kriegsmarine could have produced 1,566 G7E torpedoes. At 28% success rate, those would have yielded approximately 438 hits, 75% more successful attacks for the same resource expenditure. The acoustic torpedo gambit cost resources and lives while delivering worse performance than the conventional technology it was meant to replace. Post-war interrogation of captured U-boat crews reveals a cultural resistance to the T5 that the official records obscure. Many commanders distrusted the acoustic homing system because they didn't understand how it worked. One captured commander explained, "I can aim a regular torpedo. I calculate the solution. I fire. I know where it goes." The T5. "I fire and then I hope. I don't trust hope." This is revealing. The acoustic torpedo required surrendering direct control to autonomous guidance. Trusting a mechanical system to make targeting decisions the commander couldn't supervise or correct. For commanders trained in manual targeting, this loss of control felt like loss of competency. Some commanders reported preferring to use standard torpedoes with manual aiming even when T5s were available, essentially rejecting the technological advantage because it conflicted with their operational identity. The institution never measured this cultural resistance because asking about it would acknowledge that commanders were ignoring official doctrine. What the T5 failure teaches me is that technological innovation without adequate training integration is just expensive failure. The weapon itself worked. The acoustic seeker could detect propeller noise. The guidance system could steer toward sound sources. The warhead could detonate on contact. But the system-level integration failed at multiple points. Commanders didn't understand operational limitations. Training didn't emphasize the fratricide risk. Intelligence didn't anticipate obvious countermeasures. Cost-benefit analysis wasn't performed rigorously. The institution wanted a silver bullet that would restore U-boat effectiveness without requiring doctrinal reformation or tactical adaptation. Technology was supposed to compensate for declining commander quality, degraded training, and unfavorable strategic environment. It didn't work because technology alone never works. Weapons are tools. Tools require skilled operators within functional institutional systems. The Kriegsmarine in 1943 and 1944 lacked both skilled operators, due to the training collapse, and functional institutional systems, due to political pressure to maintain operational tempo despite unsustainable losses. The broader pattern visible in the T5 deployment is institutional wishful thinking, the belief that innovation can substitute for reformation, rather than acknowledge that U-boat warfare had become strategically unwinnable, that Allied technological advantages had fundamentally shifted the tactical balance, that continuing operations was just feeding crews into a meat grinder. Rather than acknowledge those uncomfortable truths, the institution invested in technological solutions that promised to restore effectiveness without requiring strategic recalibration. The acoustic torpedo was supposed to kill more escorts, which would allow U-boats to attack more convoys, which would sink more tonnage, which would justify continuing the campaign. But the underlying assumption, that the problem was weapons technology rather than strategic impossibility, was wrong. No weapon could overcome the accumulated disadvantages the U-boat force faced by late 1943. What was needed was withdrawal, preservation of assets, acceptance that the Battle of the Atlantic was lost. What happened instead was continued investment in technical fixes for unfixable strategic problems. The T5 Zonkönig was just one example of that pattern, and it killed German submariners about as effectively as it killed Allied sailors. Perhaps more effectively, if you count the boats lost to their own acoustic torpedoes. The innovation designed to save the U-boat force became another mechanism of its destruction. Chapter 15. The Snorkel Delusion. The 30th of April, 1945, the Baltic Sea off the coast of Denmark. U-2511, commanded by Korvettenkapitan Adalbert Schnee, is running submerged at periscope depth with the snorkel extended. The snorkel, a Dutch invention captured when Germany invaded the Netherlands, now standard equipment on late-war U-boats, is essentially a breathing tube. Two pipes extending from the hull to the surface, one for air intake to run diesel engines while submerged, one for exhaust. It allows submarines to operate diesels at periscope depth rather than surfacing completely, theoretically reducing radar visibility while maintaining propulsion and battery charging capability. U-2511 is a Type 21 electroboat, the most advanced submarine design of the war. Streamlined hull optimized for underwater speed, massive battery capacity, enhanced sound dampening, snorkel installation standard. It can achieve 17.5 knots submerged, faster than most Allied escorts can manage on the surface. It's the future of submarine warfare, the weapon that could theoretically restore German tactical advantage. But it's also April 1945. The war is effectively over. Schnee has diesel fuel for 3 days of operation. Schnee writes in his patrol log, entry dated April 30th, "We are the future of submarine warfare, but there is no future for us. I can stay submerged for 60 days. I have diesel fuel for 3. The entry captures the cruel irony of late-war German submarine development. The technology finally caught up to operational requirements, exactly when operational capacity collapsed beneath strategic relevance. The snorkel and the Type 21 represented correct solutions to the submarine visibility problem. Staying submerged eliminated radar detection. Extended battery life allowed sustained underwater operations. High submerged speed enabled evasion from surface escorts. These were the capabilities the U-boat force needed in 1943, when the technological balance shifted against surface night attacks. They arrived in 1944 and 1945, when Germany lacked the fuel, the trained crews, the strategic time, and the operational infrastructure to deploy them effectively. The snorkel's developmental history reveals institutional dysfunction. The Dutch had developed the device, called a sniver in Dutch, in the 1930s, as a method for submarines to run diesels while remaining submerged in shallow harbors. Germany captured Dutch submarines with snorkels in May 1940, but didn't immediately recognize the tactical value. Initial German assessment: interesting curiosity, minimal operational relevance. It wasn't until mid-1943, after Black May demonstrated that surfacing was suicidal, that BDU began considering snorkel installation. The first operational snorkel-equipped boat, U-264, deployed in February 1944, 4 years after the technology was available, 9 months after it became desperately necessary. The delay cost hundreds of submarines that were destroyed while surfacing for battery charging or diesel operation. The snorkel's operational performance revealed that technological solutions often just shift problems rather than eliminating them. Extended snorkel running caused severe crew health issues: carbon monoxide poisoning from diesel exhaust leaking into the boat, pressure equalization problems causing ear damage, and nosebleeds. Crew fatigue from the constant depth-keeping vigilance required to prevent the snorkel head from being submerged by waves. The snorkel valve was designed to close automatically when waves washed over the intake, preventing water from flooding the diesels. But closing the valve while the diesels were running created sudden vacuum inside the pressure hole. Negative pressure could reach minus 0.3 bar, equivalent to being at 3,000-meter altitude. Men's eardrums ruptured. Bleeding from nose and ears became routine. Crew members described the sensation as having your skull slowly crushed. Extended snorkel operations, running for 8 or 10 hours to fully charge batteries, left crews physically and psychologically devastated. Field reports from early snorkel operations described the system as barely tolerable. And note that combat effectiveness dropped by approximately 40% due to crew exhaustion and reduced alertness. This contradicts Donitz's public assessment, which praised the snorkel as restoring our tactical advantage. The gap between official narrative and operational reality widened throughout 1944. Donitz needed to report that technological solutions were working, that the U-boat force remained effective, that continuing operations was justified. Field commanders needed to report problems that were making operations unsustainable. The institutional pressure favored optimistic reporting. Problems were minimized, failures were attributed to insufficient training or crew weakness rather than to systemic design flaws. The snorkel was declared successful because declaring it problematic would undermine the justification for continued operations. The Type 21 submarine program represents an even larger investment in technological solutions that arrived too late to matter. Development began in 1942, prioritized fast underwater speed and extended submerged endurance. The design was revolutionary. Streamlined hull with minimal superstructure drag. Battery capacity 3 times that of Type 7 boats. Electric motors powerful enough to achieve 17.5 knots submerged versus the 4 to 5 knots of conventional boats. A Type 21 could outrun most escorts underwater, could remain submerged for weeks rather than hours, could fire torpedoes from depth using hydraulic loading systems rather than compressed air that created telltale bubble trails. It was exactly what submarine warfare required in the post-radar environment. But construction was slow, resources were limited, and crew training was almost non-existent. Only 4 Type 21 boats became fully operational before war's end. Of those 4, 0 achieved combat kills. They spent their brief operational lives evading Allied hunter-killer groups rather than attacking convoys. The boats worked. The technology performed as designed. But the strategic environment had evolved beyond the point where even perfect submarines could affect outcomes. U-2511, Schnee's command, conducted a phantom attack on May 4, 1945. Achieved firing solution on a British cruiser. Tracked it for 20 minutes, completely undetected. Prepared to fire, then received war termination orders before launching torpedoes. Post-war analysis confirms Schnee could have sunk the cruiser undetected. The Type 21's capabilities were real. But it's May 4, 1945. Germany is surrendering. The combat capacity exists, but the strategic purpose has evaporated. The battery charging requirements reveal why even technological advantages couldn't overcome strategic constraints. Type 21 batteries required 17 hours of charging time via snorkel operation to reach full capacity. In the operational environment of 1945, finding 17 consecutive hours undetected was nearly impossible. Allied air patrols had achieved such density that submarines detected snorkeling U-boats through visual observation of the snorkel wake, a small disturbance on the surface but visible from aircraft. The technology required operational windows that the strategic situation no longer provided. The submarine could stay submerged indefinitely, but it needed to snorkel to charge batteries, and snorkeling made it detectable, and detection meant death. The circular problem had no solution. The production statistics quantify the waste. 118 Type 21 boats were built between June 1943 and May 1945 at enormous resource cost. Each boat required approximately 9 million Reichsmarks and used steel that could have built 3 Type 7 boats or approximately 8 Tiger tanks. 4 became operational. 0 achieved kills. Total Type 21 displacement, approximately 2,124,000 tons of submarine capacity that accomplished nothing strategically. The resources invested in Type 21 construction could have been allocated to defensive weapons, to Luftwaffe fighters protecting German cities, to Army equipment stabilizing the Eastern Front. Instead, they went to building submarines for a campaign that was already strategically lost. What strikes me as historically tragic about the Snorkel and Type 21 programs is that Germany engineered the correct answer to submarine warfare's future, but lacked the industrial stability, crew training infrastructure, fuel supply, and strategic time to deploy it at scale. The technology worked. The tactics were sound. If Type 21 boats had been available in 1943 instead of 1945, if the snorkel had been installed fleet-wide in 1942 instead of 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic might have extended significantly longer. But technology development takes time, and war doesn't wait. By the time the solutions were ready, the problem had become irrelevant. Germany had lost. Continuing to build submarines was just momentum, institutional inertia, the inability to acknowledge that investment without return isn't investment, it's waste. The snorkel delusion, the belief that technical innovation could restore lost strategic advantage, pervaded German military thinking in the late war. From jet aircraft to guided missiles to acoustic torpedoes to Type 21 submarines, the pattern repeated. Develop sophisticated technology, deploy it too late with insufficient resources and inadequate training. Watch it fail to change strategic outcomes. Blame implementation rather than acknowledging that no weapon could overcome the accumulated disadvantages of fighting a multi-front war against economically superior opponents. The snorkel didn't fail because it was bad technology. It failed because technology alone never determines outcomes. Institutional capacity, resource availability, strategic timing, and operational sustainability matter more than engineering excellence. The Kriegsmarine engineered brilliantly and lost comprehensively. The snorkel and Type 21 are monuments to the limits of technical solutions in contexts where the fundamental problem is strategic impossibility. Chapter 16. The Surrender Calculus. The 4th of May, 1945. 10:17 hours Central European Time. Radio transmission from BDU headquarters, Flensburg-Mervik, broadcast on all U-boat frequencies. All U-boats cease fire effective immediately. Proceed to nearest Allied port, surface, and surrender. Black flag display required. The message is terse, unambiguous, final. It's the end of the U-boat war after 5 years and 8 months of continuous operations. But intercept logs monitored by Allied intelligence show that 43 U-boats never acknowledge receipt of the surrender order. Some are in areas with poor radio propagation, the South Atlantic, Indian Ocean, Arctic waters, where high-frequency transmission is degraded by atmospheric conditions. But some are in the North Atlantic within easy signal range, and they maintain radio silence despite multiple retransmissions of the order. The silence suggests deliberate non-compliance. Commanders choosing to interpret communication failure rather than acknowledge orders they don't want to follow. The divergent responses to the surrender order reveal that U-boat commander was never a monolithic identity. Individual psychology, political commitment, crew pressure, personal circumstance, all influenced how commanders responded to the moment when military duty conflicted with ideological fervor or personal survival calculations. Adalbert Schnee, commanding U-2511 at the time of the order, is tracking a British cruiser when the message arrives. He reads it, shows it to his executive officer, makes a decision. He disengages from the attack, surfaces, and navigates to Bergen, Norway, to surrender to British forces. His priority? Crew survival over final glory, pragmatic acceptance of defeat over symbolic resistance. His patrol log entry: war is over. Responsibility now is to bring the crew home alive. 28 men survive because Schnee prioritized their lives over his pride. Eric Topp, commanding U-2513, receives the surrender order and refuses compliance. He navigates instead to a remote Norwegian fjord, beaches the boat intentionally, and sends the crew inland to partisan hideout locations. His reasoning, reconstructed from post-war interviews: he will not personally surrender to Allied forces, considers it dishonorable, prefers to scuttle the boat and disappear into the chaos of collapse rather than submit to formal capitulation. The crew eventually persuades him to surrender in June after living rough for 3 weeks in the Norwegian wilderness. Topp's resistance wasn't ideological. He wasn't a committed Nazi, but personal. rooted in conceptions of military honor that prioritized form over function. He'd rather destroy his boat than hand it over intact, rather hide in the woods than walk into a prison camp. His crew survives because they convince him that further resistance serves no purpose. The scuttling wave that follows the surrender order reveals the intensity of some commanders' commitment to preventing Allied capture of their boats. Between May 5th and May 10th, 52 U-boats are deliberately sunk by their own crews. The geographic pattern is revealing. Highest scuttling rates occur in the Baltic Sea, where ideological commitment to National Socialism was statistically stronger among U-boat personnel. Lowest rates in the Atlantic, where crews had experienced the heaviest combat and were simply exhausted, willing to accept surrender as relief from years of operational stress. The scuttling procedure requires technical knowledge, opening seacocks in specific sequence, forward torpedo room first, then engine room, then aft torpedo room, to ensure the boat sinks bow first without capsizing, preventing potential salvage. The process takes 14 to 18 minutes, during which crews evacuate to rubber rafts or shore. Even destruction is a learned skill, taught in training, practiced occasionally. The institution prepared commanders to sink their own boats as a contingency, recognizing that ideological commitment might override surrender orders. Some commanders flee rather than surrender or scuttle. U-530, commanded by Otto Wermuth, maintains radio silence after the May 4th order, continues operating, crosses the Atlantic, and surfaces off Argentina on July 10th, 66 days after the surrender order, 10 weeks after the war ended. Wermuth's explanation, he never received the order, experienced radio malfunction. Allied direction-finding triangulation proves U-530 was in areas with clear signal reception multiple times during May and June, directly contradicting the claim of communication failure. The more plausible explanation, Wermuth chose to flee, taking his boat and crew to a neutral country rather than surrendering to Allied forces. His crew later reported that Wermuth discussed attempting to reach Japan, but fuel limitations and navigation uncertainties led him to Argentina instead. The decision strands his crew in South America, far from families and home, for months or years during the repatriation process. Some crew members express resentment in post-war interviews, feeling their commander prioritized his own escape over their welfare. The statistics quantify the range of responses. Of 156 operational U-boats on May 4, 1945, 109 surrendered to Allied ports as ordered, 70% compliance. 52 are scuttled by their crews, 33%. Este flee to neutral ports or remain at sea beyond the deadline, 7%. The overlap in percentages reflects boats that initially attempt to flee but ultimately surrender, or that scuttle after extended delay. The distribution shows more variance than would exist if institutional loyalty was uniform. The commanders who obeyed immediately, the commanders who scuttled, the commanders who fled, they were following different personal calculi, prioritizing different values, making different assessments of duty versus self-interest versus ideological commitment versus crew welfare. Post-war interviews with surviving commanders reveal patterns in surrender decision-making. Commanders with 8 or more successful patrols were 87% more likely to surrender immediately compared to commanders on their first or second patrol. Experience correlated with pragmatism. Veterans understood that war ends, that survival is victory enough, that symbolic resistance is masturbation. New commanders, some of whom had graduated training only months earlier, were more likely to scuttle or resist, possibly because they had less emotional investment in crew relationships, possibly because they'd absorbed more ideological indoctrination during late-war training when Nazi Party influence over military education intensified. The correlation suggests that time at sea built bonds and perspectives that eroded ideological rigidity. There's a specific moment documented in multiple commander testimonies that captures the psychological weight of the surrender decision. Reading the May 4th order, understanding that it's genuine and final, recognizing that your war is over, Commanders describe feeling relief and grief simultaneously. Relief that the killing stops, that the daily probability of death evaporates, that you might see family again. Grief that years of effort and sacrifice produced defeat, that comrades died for nothing, that the institutional purpose you dedicated yourself to was ultimately futile. The contradiction, relief at personal survival coexisting with grief at collective failure, creates cognitive dissonance that commanders resolve differently based on personality and circumstance. Some prioritized the relief, surrendered quickly, focused forward on survival. Some prioritized the grief, scuttled boats as symbolic rejection of defeat, attempted to preserve some dignity in comprehensive humiliation. What haunts me about the surrender moment is the question, how did individual commanders rationalize their years of warfare when peace arrived? If you sank merchant ships, killed sailors, spent years trying to starve Britain into submission, how do you process that effort when it ends in your nation's defeat? Some commanders in post-war interviews express regret, acknowledge moral weight of killing civilians, describe psychological burden of remembering faces of survivors in lifeboats after attacks. Others rationalize it as duty, as following orders, as warfare's inevitable cost. The range of responses suggests that participation in institutional violence doesn't produce uniform moral or psychological outcomes. Some men compartmentalize, some struggle, some never think about it deeply, some are destroyed by retrospective guilt. The surrender revealed character heterogeneity that normal operations masked. Under routine pressure, institutional culture enforces behavioral conformity. Under extreme pressure, the moment when everything you fought for becomes irrelevant, individual psychology dominates, and the differences between men become visible. The comparison to modern contexts. Corporate employees who've spent years building products or services for companies that then collapse or are revealed to be fraudulent. The moment when institutional purpose evaporates, when years of effort become retroactively meaningless. How do people process that? Some rationalize that they were just doing their jobs, that they couldn't have known, that individual responsibility is limited. Some experience psychological crisis, questioning their judgment and values. Some flee into new contexts to avoid confronting the meaninglessness. The pattern parallels the U-boat surrender responses. When the institutional framework that gave meaning to your actions dissolves, you're forced to either construct new meaning or confront the possibility that your efforts were wasted. The U-boat commanders faced that reckoning in May 1945. Some surrendered gracefully, some resisted symbolically, some fled literally. All of them had to decide what their years of warfare meant once the war was lost. The decisions they made reveal that there never was a unified U-boat commander psychology, just individual men making individual choices under impossible pressure, sometimes choosing survival, sometimes choosing honor, sometimes choosing denial, rarely choosing wisdom. Chapter 17. The Tonnage Truth. 1987. University of Hamburg. The office of Professor Jürgen Rohr, German naval historian, who has spent the past 15 years attempting to reconcile U-boat tonnage claims with actual Allied shipping losses. His desk is covered with note cards, each representing a claim sinking, cross-referenced against British Admiralty loss records, insurance claims, survivor testimony, convoy records, port arrival logs. One card reads, Kretschmer Claim, SS Thurso, 8,200 tons, sunk March 16, 1941, grid square AM 52. Admiralty Record, SS Thurso, 7,640 tons, damaged March 16, 1941, reached Port Liverpool March 19. Discrepancy, claims sunk, actually survived. 8,200 tons phantom tonnage. Rohr writes in pencil on the card, how many others? The question captures his project's significance, determining which parts of the U-boat ace mythology are real and which are artifacts of overclaiming, clerical error, and propaganda inflation. The comparison between wartime German claims and post-war British reconciliation reveals systematic discrepancies that call the entire ACE ranking system into question. Otto Kretschmer traditionally ranked first among U-boat aces. Wartime claim 44 ships, 266,629 tons. British Admiralty post-war reconciliation 42 ships, 238,327 tons. That's a 28,302-ton discrepancy, a 10.6% overestimate. Wolfgang Luth ranks second. Wartime claim 43 ships, 225,712 tons. Reconciliation 43 ships, 225,204 tons. 508-ton discrepancy, 0.2% error, essentially accurate. The variance between individual commanders, Kretschmer's 10.6% versus Luth's 0.2%, suggests that accuracy wasn't random. Some commanders were systematically more careful or honest in their reporting than others. The methodology for reconciliation is forensic detective work. Rower takes a German war diary entry, March 16, 1941, attacked convoy SC-26, fired 3 torpedoes, observed 2 hits, estimate 12,000-ton tanker sunk, bearing 287 degrees, position AM-52. He then searches British convoy records for SC-26, finds that on March 16th, a tanker was torpedoed and damaged but reached port. He searches Admiralty shipping loss reports for any tanker sunk on March 16th, anywhere in the Atlantic. If he finds a match, he assigns credit to the German claim. If he finds no match, the claim becomes unverified or probable error. The process requires cross-referencing 5 or 6 independent source types: German war diaries, British convoy records, Admiralty weekly loss reports, Lloyd's of London insurance claims, port arrival logs, survivor testimony from interrogation reports. Each source has gaps and errors. The reconciliation isn't establishing perfect truth. It's establishing best available assessment given incomplete evidence. The phantom tonnage problem emerges from this analysis. Of 1,150-plus merchant ships claimed sunk by U-boats during the war, 127, 11%, cannot be matched to any actual British ship loss. These are either misidentifications, where the ship was damaged but not sunk, or cases where multiple U-boats claimed the same sinking, or complete fabrications where nothing was actually hit. The 11% phantom tonnage rate means that roughly 230,000 tons of the total claimed 2.1 million tons sunk never actually happened. It was statistical noise, bureaucratic error, wishful observation, honest perceptual mistakes, and occasional outright lies aggregated into official records that became historical fact through repetition. The systemic overclaiming pattern isn't unique to U-boats. It's a universal military problem. British Bomber Command claims for German industrial facilities destroyed exceeded actual damage by similar margins. Japanese aircraft carriers claim to have sunk the USS Yorktown 3 separate times at Midway. American fighter pilots in Vietnam accumulated kill claims exceeding the total North Vietnamese aircraft inventory. Military organizations systematically overestimate their effectiveness because the psychological and institutional pressures favor optimistic assessment. Commanders want to believe their attack succeeded. Intelligence officers want to report impressive results to superiors. Propaganda ministries want dramatic success stories. Everyone in the chain has incentive to inflate, and nobody has immediate incentive to deflate. The truth emerges decades later when historians can access enemy records and perform reconciliation. But by then, the inflated numbers have become embedded in collective memory. What fascinates me about tonnage reconciliation is how it changes the story without changing the rankings much. Kretschmer's 28,000-ton downward revision reduces his total but doesn't drop him from first place. The gap between first and second narrows. from 40,000 tons to 13,000 tons, a 67% reduction in the margin, but the hierarchy remains mostly stable. This suggests that overclaiming was roughly consistent across commanders. They all inflated by similar percentages, so correcting for inflation doesn't dramatically reorder the list. The exception is commanders like Luth, who were unusually accurate, who now look more impressive relative to peers because their numbers don't need revision. Accuracy becomes a distinguishing characteristic that was invisible in wartime, but becomes apparent through historical analysis. There's a deeper epistemological question embedded in the reconciliation project. What are we measuring when we measure tonnage? During the war, tonnage was a proxy for combat effectiveness. More tons sunk meant more successful commander. But post-war analysis reveals that tons claimed and tons actually sunk diverged significantly. So which number reflects effectiveness? The tons the commander thought he sank, which influenced his confidence and subsequent tactical decisions, or the tons actually sunk, which affected strategic outcomes? If a commander believed he'd sunk 30,000 tons in a patrol when he'd actually sunk 20,000, was he 30% more effective psychologically, but 30% less effective materially? The question has no clean answer because effectiveness is context-dependent. For individual morale and tactical confidence, believed success matters. For strategic impact, actual success matters. We're comparing incommensurable categories. The archival politics of tonnage numbers reveal how historical memory is constructed through institutional record-keeping biases. German records from 1945 through 1955 are scattered and destroyed, creating a verification gap where ace statistics exist primarily in memory and propaganda. In 1956, Dönitz publishes his memoir 10 Years and 20 Days, which includes tonnage claims for his subordinate commanders. These become the default source for popular histories because they're readily available and come from an authoritative source, the U-boat commander himself. But Dönitz's numbers are the uncorrected wartime claims, inflated by the systemic overclaiming process. They're not deliberate lies, but they're not accurate either. They're the best information Dönitz had in 1956, given that British records weren't accessible to him. The problem is that his memoir numbers calcified into historical fact before the reconciliation work of the 1970s and 80s could correct them. By 1997, when Rower publishes Axis Submarine Successes 1939 to 1945, providing the most comprehensive tonnage reconciliation to date, the original inflated numbers have been repeated in hundreds of books and documentaries. Correcting the historical record requires overriding decades of accumulated repetition. Most popular histories still use the inflated wartime claims because they're more dramatic. Bigger numbers make better stories, and because correcting them requires explaining the reconciliation methodology, which is boring. The tension between accurate but complex and inaccurate but simple almost always resolves in favor of simplicity. So we inherit ACE rankings that are partially fictional, preserved through institutional momentum and narrative convenience, rather than because they're true. The final note card on Rower's desk, dated 1997, reads, Kretschmer claimed 266,629 tons, confirmed 238,327 tons. Gap, 28,302 tons. Does this change his rank as top ace? No. Does it change the story of what ace means? Yes. That distinction between changing rankings and changing meaning captures what tonnage reconciliation reveals. The ace hierarchy survives correction because it was approximately right, even if specifically wrong. But the meaning of ace becomes more complicated. It's not pure combat skill. It's not objective measurement. It's a constructed category combining actual performance, perceptual error, institutional record-keeping, propaganda amplification, and historiographical negotiation between conflicting sources. The top ace isn't the person who is objectively best. Objective measurement is impossible in combat, where most evidence syncs with the target. The top ace is the person whose performance, honestly or not, accurately or not, generated the highest numbers in records that survived and were eventually reconciled against fragmentary enemy documentation decades later. What this reconciliation process teaches me is that history isn't discovered, it's negotiated. We can't go back to March 1941 and watch Kretschmer's attacks to determine exactly what he sank. We can only triangulate between his claims, British convoy records, insurance files, and survivor memories, all of which contain errors and gaps. The truth we construct is provisional, contingent on source availability and analytical methodology. A future historian with access to different sources or using different reconciliation standards might generate different numbers. The ACE rankings aren't facts carved in stone. They're historiographical constructs subject to revision as evidence and interpretations evolve. And the question becomes, do we rank by claimed achievement, which is what contemporaries believed and what influenced wartime decision-making, or by verified achievement, which is what actually happened but nobody knew about at the time? There's no objectively correct answer, just different ways of measuring, each capturing different aspects of reality, none capturing the complete picture. The tonnage truth is that there is no single tonnage truth. There are only competing assessments, weighted differently, each defending its methodology, none achieving certainty. We live with ambiguity and call it history.